Chapter 81, Exiting 3. Voom! When Damien felt his feet once again touch the flat ground, he wasn't excited nor was he wary. He was simply overwhelmed by the sensory input he was receiving. Through every pore in his skin, every nerve in his body, and even the veins of his mana circuit, Damien felt an influx of energy that he couldn't place his finger on. His entire body was shining with blinding blue light as he was involuntarily lifted off the ground. And slowly, he felt what was truly happening. Starlight. This was the change he had missed within the secret realm due to its lack of stars. He only felt the burn of the sun and the freezing of the moon, but even those were faint since the celestial bodies weren't complete. Now that he was back in the real world, he felt a connection with every single star and celestial body in his general vicinity. He now understood why the class was called Celestial instead of Star Master or something. Even the planet he was currently in wasn't spared from this connection. As Damien was basking in the overflow of sensations he felt, a connection even stronger than the rest started forming. The tidal wave of energy this connection was attempting to give him almost pushed away that of all the other stars combined. After all, it was the celestial body he had the strongest ties to. It was Earth. After 3.5 years away from home, he'd finally received an unshakable understanding of its position. Although on the cosmic scale, Earth could be considered close to Aperon, it wasn't anywhere near that in reality. Damien realized how little mana he had when compared to the distance, berating himself for even entertaining the thought of teleporting home. But now, that wasn't a foolish thought anymore. Damien felt that if he used his connection to Earth, the mana cost to return there would be severely cut. Without any further thought, Damien took out his stat boost potion and consumed it. He moved its essence towards his intelligence stat. The intelligence stat wasn't simply there to increase reaction time and control over the body, nor was it simply a measure of increased computing power. While these were auxiliary functions of the stat, it also affected how much mana one could hold in their body. Damien was slightly different since he had many other facets that increase his mana capacity, but this was still applicable to him. Even if the boost from the potion was small, it was still something useful for him. The starlight surrounding Damien slowly faded, making him conscious of his surroundings. Only then did he notice the countless stairs headed in his direction. Rose and Zara were both next to him with their eyes wide and mouths slightly agape, but they had traveled with him long enough to know he was fine. He had told them about the contents of his class change when he became a Celestial. The other reactions were much more exaggerated. There were 38 people around them, with 9 seemingly either being stuck in the secret realm or dying. Most of them had either terror or a downcast look on their faces. After all, they were extremely arrogant about their gains before they returned to the real world, but the first thing they saw was others around them with the aura of a third class. And it wasn't just Damien. Rose next to him had this aura and 2 others did as well. Naturally, it was Ethan and the Dark Horse. Ignoring everyone else, these 2 headed in Damien's direction. "Ha ha ha, it seems like you're still slightly ahead of me, friend," Ethan said as he initiated a strong bear hug with Damien. Damien wasn't really a shy person, especially with friends, so he returned in kind. Except he put a little extra strength into his hold. Feeling this, Ethan did the same, and before they could get into a full-on competition, Rose slapped Damien on his back. "Wow, you 2 are so close. Ever considered getting even closer?" Looking at each other, Damien and Ethan shuddered. They knew what she meant, but they wished they didn't. Quickly pushing each other away, they ended their greeting with a handshake. The Dark Horse also greeted them, and it was only now that they learned his name. He was Matthew Iriel. However, due to his cold and distant demeanor, they weren't able to find out where he came from. The reason they associated was simply due to them all being similar levels of talent and rivals. They then started sharing the stories of what they found in the secret realm. Damien and Rose went first, speaking about Godspark Mountain and the legacy tombs they found. They did, however, choose to leave out some details, especially of the ancient temple, which they described as a second legacy tomb. Ethan's eyes sparkled. You guys made it almost all the way up Godspark Mountain. Nice." Then he began recounting his own experience. Ethan remained in the lava-filled environment for a good 3 months before he decided to leave. During that time, he simply trained and mastered his fire control. He hadn't put much focus on it before, but after fighting Damien, he changed his approach. After that, he decided to leave, but this was where his story got interesting. On his way, he was confronted by a group of massive men, who he later learned to be the barbarian race they were told to avoid. Being a musclehead, though, Ethan didn't care about this and simply saw them as opponents to face. He sparred with some of their members, beating them in a purely physical contest before they invited him to their village. From there, he spent 3 months living as their brother. He would hunt with them, celebrate with them, and even got a few of their signature tattoos in tribute to them, which he then showed off to Damien with a proud look on his face. They took him to a legacy tomb which they had enshrined as a place for people to take their rite of passage, as they called it, and allowed him to clear it. He used the rewards he gained along with the hunting he did to swiftly reach third class. Ethan's story was relatively calm, even with him becoming friends with a random warring race that held completely different customs from those outside. Next was Matthew, but he didn't say much. He simply told them how he landed in a dark, eerie forest filled with undead creatures. He then told them he had found a legacy tomb and cleared it, obtaining an inheritance. The other three nodded. They could feel a slightly ghastly aura radiating from Matthew that he didn't possess before they entered, and they now had an explanation for it. As they spoke, they remained in the same place, but all the other geniuses had already begun making their way back to their respective homes. The leaders of the various nations had already returned, and they were the only ones present in the vast plain. And now, the four would have to go separate ways. "Don't worry, bro. I'll be coming to the beast domain at some point soon, so we'll meet again then. Let's properly brawl it out at that time," Damien said as he gave Ethan a fist bump. Ethan didn't really know the concept of fist bumping but went with it anyway. "All right, you don't have to rush, though. It'd be embarrassing if you rushed over just to get your ass handed to you." After a bit more banter, they parted ways. Matthew had also left to wherever he had come from. The only ones left in the plane were Damien, Rose, and Zara. "So ready to go meet your father-in-law," Rose suddenly said. Damien's face went whiter than a sheet of paper as he robotically turned his head to face her. "I'm sorry, I don't think I heard you right. Can you repeat what you just said?" Rose smiled mischievously. "Your father-in-law, of course. What? Did you think you could just have a casual relationship with the princess of the Adelaire Empire?" "Ha ha ha," Damien forced out a laugh, and then he ran. "If you can't catch me, I don't have to get married, ha ha ha." Rose's face burned red in annoyance. "If you don't want to marry me so much, why don't you just say it?" She then sprinted after him. Only Zara was left, confused at what just happened. But with the thought that the two were playing around, Zara also got excited and ran after them. "Wait for me." Damien was in the front, still running at full speed, but unlike his outward appearance, his mind was calm. Truthfully, he already knew that agreeing to be with Rose was essentially guaranteeing they would get married. He had been in this world long enough to understand that dating culture wasn't as open-minded as Earth, and most people would only have one partner in their entire lives unless, of course, they had a harem. At first, he hesitated at the thought of getting married. He was young and had his whole life ahead of him, but as time passed, his hesitation lessened. This was especially true after the Legacy Tomb trial when Damien started considering a harem. He realized that even if she was his wife, it was only a vow to stay together till the ends of time. There were no legal documents, taxes, or prenuptial agreements like Earth. They would still only be dating currently, but he had to at least become her fiancé, simply to show his sincerity. Damien stopped running at full speed, allowing Rose to catch up. Then, before she could even speak, he beat her to it. "So, aren't you going to tell me about my future father-in-law? Or are you going to make your hubby go into this meeting blind?" Rose blushed, but still smiled widely. Even if he was being sarcastic in the latter parts of his sentence, she could tell that he had accepted the rest. So, Rose gave him a not-so-brief overview of her father's personality as the trio made their way to Aurora. Chapter 82, Meeting 1. It wouldn't take long for the trio to reach Aurora with their current speed. Actually, they could have reached faster if Damien just warped them there, but since their current conversation was important, they opted to just fly Zara's back. Rose gave Damien a proper explanation of not only her father's personality, but also her own past. Damien listened intently, and after hearing the story of what happened to her mother, he doubted whether he could actually deal with multiple women or not. Since they had time right now, Damien decided to have this conversation with Rose as well as solidify their relationship. After their second kiss, they had basically already gotten together, but they never said anything to confirm it. The first confirmation was the matter Rose said about her father. And the conversation wasn't really anything special. With how they had both already known each other's feelings for a long time, it ended as soon as it began. Its only purpose was to serve as verbal confirmation. While Damien was hesitating about how to bring up the other issue, Rose did it for him. Also, I don't mind if you have multiple women in the future. I know my mother died in the schemes that come from a large harem, so I'll make sure to limit yours so it doesn't get out of hand. While Damien was staring at her with his eyes and mouth wide, Rose continued with a grin. I'll always be the first wife anyway. Plus, I already know you like that girl you told me about from Earth, but don't expect me to just silently watch you get with her. Damien didn't have any words, silently nodding to show his agreement before he began absent-mindedly staring at nothing. It took a few hours for him to calm down, but he finally remembered that he had to check his status. 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 Damien Void. Half human, half beast. Male, age 20. Level 100, Celestial. Experience value, 0/150,000. Title S, Bearer of the Void Physique Evolver. Affinities, Space. Physique, Void Physique. Magic Power, 18,000. STR, 375. AGI, 380. Def, 370. INT, 400. Dex, 380. Skills, Warp Level 10, Dimensional Magic Level 1, High Level Regeneration Level Max, Void Sword Art Level 3, Mana Sense Level Max, Devour Level 5, Vector Control Level 8, Lightning Magic Level Max, Inventory. Trait S, Shock Absorption, All-Seeing Eyes Level 4, Dragon's Breath, Anantimatrix. Damien didn't really understand what was going on in his status window. The stat boost he received could be explained by the baptism of starlight he received, but his affinities section was incomprehensible. Trying to send his senses into that area of his body where he figured his affinities were located, he felt much more there than his spatial affinity. For one, his lightning wasn't actually gone. He could still feel it, and he could still wield lightning attribute power. However, he felt that something had changed about it. No, it was like his lightning attribute had become a part of something greater. Although it wasn't an explanation for the question marks that replaced it, at least he had some sort of lead on what happened. It was the second set of question marks that left him baffled. The energy he associated with this question mark seemed to not exist at all, but he could still feel it within him. It felt familiar, but he was sure he'd never come in touch with it before. This wasn't something he could understand in a short amount of time. He instinctively knew that he would have to take a long period of gathering insights to understand what the new affinity was. While he was ruminating over the changes in his status, the trio had finally arrived at Aurora. Seeing the bustling capital city again reminded Damien of when he had first arrived in this world and become an adventurer. The difference between those two times was immense, though. The short year and a half he had spent on Aparin was filled with action. Last time, he could only cover at most half of the massive city with his awareness, but now the entire city was clearly portrayed before him with ease. He felt that if he wanted, he could destroy even half of this city if he tried hard enough. though he had no reason to do so. Reaching the city entrance, Zara landed on the ground and shrunk. With Rose already disguised before they even left the secret realm, the trio simply walked into the city like any normal group of people. The meeting with the Emperor would be a pretty serious event, and neither of them knew what its outcome would be, so they decided to spend some time enjoying the city before they went to the palace. They walked around peacefully and enjoyed the sights, having a miniature date as the sun began to set. When night fell, the trio went to Damien's old house and stayed there. He had never sold it when he left since he felt it was useful to have, so it was still in its regular condition. Damien went to his old room and took a quick shower before hopping into bed. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Not just that, but I get the feeling that there is going to be a lot of long days in the future. My return to Earth is imminent. I can already feel that if I wanted, I could warp there right now, though warp doesn't seem like the right word. Damien felt that there was a subtle change in his warp skill. When he was teleporting to places within a normal distance limit, it'd stay the same, but if he wanted to go longer distances, he felt that his entrance would be much more extravagant. This was another reason why he chose not to warp to the capital. He knew that his dimensional magic takes some time to get used to. Even if he didn't learn anything new, he at least had to understand the changes to his current moveset. Damien lay on the bed, relaxing as he thought through his future plans when he noticed his room door open. Realizing the situation, he got the urge to sigh, but he simply closed his eyes and pretended to sleep. Rose didn't know what she was doing or why she was doing it, but everything in her body screamed for her to enter Damien's room tonight. It wasn't even her eyes that did this. Maybe it was just her emotions overwhelming her. Rose was wearing nothing but a lacy nightdress, making this venture even more risque than it previously would have been, but she hardened her will and powered through. Silently entering the room, Rose climbed into bed with Damien, attempting to gauge his reaction, but she was saddened when there wasn't any. Just as she thought to silently escape the room, she felt a strong pull and fell back to the bed. Don't be so hasty to leave. So why did our little princess decide to enter a single man's room in the middle of the night, huh? Damien teased in a low voice. Rose immediately blushed when her actions were called out. Even she herself was confused, so how could she explain it to him? But Damien was pretty clear on the reason. After all, it was a pretty normal thing. He brought her close and let her lay down on his chest. Listen, I know you're nervous that I have to go meet your dad tomorrow, but there's no need for drastic actions. Didn't we already solidify our relationship on the way here? Even if he doesn't accept, I'll do everything I can to make him change his mind. Rose slightly calmed down as she listened to Damien's steady heartbeat and soothing words. Indeed, she was extremely nervous about letting Damien meet with her dad. Besides the fact that her dad was already strict about her relationships, he didn't even know Damien's background. She figured that he would immediately condemn their relationship. So, she came here to give Damien something that couldn't be taken back. If their relationship had progressed to that level, the Emperor would be more forced to accept them, but Damien didn't want to take her in this way. He had never fancied himself a romantic, but he kept taking actions that indicated otherwise. Maybe it was more due to the fact that he wanted to take their relationship slow. But that didn't change the fact that these small actions of consideration made Rose fall deeper for him with every passing day. It had only been a year since they had been consistently interacting, so it wasn't clear whether the emotion was love quite yet, but it was infinitely close to reaching that point. As she lay in the peaceful atmosphere with Damien lightly stroking her back, Rose ended up falling asleep. Her worries had been lifted enough to allow her to do so. Damien stayed up for a bit longer, deep in thought about various matters, but he soon followed. The duo slept peacefully until the next morning when it was finally time for the fateful meeting. Chapter 83, Meeting 2. The Imperial Palace was situated on a massive hill directly in the middle of Aurora, and with its size, it was visible even from tens of kilometers away. Rose led Damien through the high-class neighborhoods that made up the hill before arriving at the gates to the palace. "Your Highness," the guards immediately bowed when they saw her. When they got close enough to the palace, Rose had already taken off her disguise. She simply nodded at the guards and entered the palace with Damien at her side. The palace was designed similarly to the many smaller variants Damien had seen during his time on Aparen. From the temple to the legacy tomb, they all had a similar structure. Upon entry, the first thing one would see was a massive hall leading to a singular set of pristine white double doors. The sides of this hall were decorated with various ornaments and aesthetics, and besides these, there were countless smaller doors leading elsewhere. These were the routes one could take to the inner palace. But at the moment, there was no need to use these doors. Rose was making a beeline for the throne hall without paying attention to anything else. She wanted to get the meeting with her father over as soon as possible so they could go back to minding their own business. When she knocked on the doors, she was met with silence before a deep voice rang out, "Enter." The doors swung open on their own, and the scene inside was revealed. Similar to the previous hall, this one was also decorated majestically, but the carpets and decorations that lined its interior seemed to all focus on accentuating a single location. That was, of course, the throne located at the end of the hall. There were seats lined up for ministers and others who would seek an audience for the emperor along the sides of the hall and two thrones at its end. Yet only one of them was occupied. The other one had stayed empty for around a decade now. It was the throne where Rose's mother used to sit. On the occupied throne sat a lone man with short pink hair and piercing ruby eyes. If the storm of magic power that surrounded Malcolm could be considered a sea of blood, the one around the emperor was more like a raging tornado. His cold gaze scanned the two, warming slightly only when he looked at Rose. "Father, I have returned," Rose said with a curt bow. The emperor nodded as he looked at the only other person in the room. Yet, this person didn't seem to have any indication of lowering himself. If this was a normal meeting with the emperor, he might have swallowed his pride and showed respect, but it wasn't. He needed to show his future father-in-law that he wasn't someone to be looked down on. "Good afternoon, Senior." The emperor continued to scan Damien with his indifferent gaze before once again looking over at Rose. It was at this point she realized he already knew what they came here for. "Father, Enough, leave for now and let me speak with him alone." Rose hesitated, but when Damien also lightly nodded at her, she reluctantly left the room. Damien and the emperor stared at each other in silence for a few minutes before one of them decided to speak. "What did you do to my daughter?" If anything, you should be asking what your daughter did to me." The emperor's eyes became sharp as he disappeared from his throne. Damien also took out his sword. Fist met metal, and a resounding clap rang through the throne hall. The emperor stayed still, but Damien was thrown back towards the door. But he didn't allow himself to stay in such a vulnerable position. He teleported a few meters behind the emperor, carrying his velocity through the spatial layers and recycling the force from the emperor's previous punch to strike him. Molecules were forced into vibration and lightning crackled in the vicinity before tens of plasma beams also shot towards the emperor. And on top of it all, Void Sword Art third step, spatial collapse. Damien directly used his strongest move. He was painfully aware that he couldn't stack up to a fourth class, so he decided to use everything he had in the first exchange. The emperor stood still and watched calmly as the barrage of different attacks headed his way. When the beams of plasma and lightning neared him, he sliced his arm down at a speed Damien couldn't follow. The air around the emperor ripped in half, causing space to tear. Every single one of those beams was swallowed by the spatial crack that formed. It was then that space began to distort and twist, but how could someone who could rip apart space itself be trapped within its collapse? The emperor used the same method to destroy the spatial collapse. Damien immediately teleported away. His face was twisted into a frown. This was the first time he had ever faced someone who could affect space, leaving him at a disadvantage. His eyes shined as he learned about a weakness he wasn't aware of. If it was a couple of months ago, he would have been completely helpless already, but he had gained an entirely new arsenal of moves recently. Concentrating on one of the many ethereal connections he had gained, he manifested a flame on his palm. The Emperor finally had a reaction when he saw the flame on Damien's palm. His brow raised and he looked on with interest, seemingly curious about Damien's next move. Sadly, this was a power Damien only recently gained and didn't have time to experiment with yet, so he could only use it in its most rudimentary form, a fireball. He simply threw the fireball at the Emperor, who captured it in a ball seemingly made entirely of the surrounding air, and observed it. This power is interesting. It seems to come from the sun itself, but it is also not technically borrowed power. Looking back at Damien, the Emperor nodded. Let's stop here for now. Damien also nodded. He wasn't able to do even the slightest bit of damage, but this was expected. No matter how short it was, he was still glad he got the opportunity to spar with someone this much stronger than him. He also got to see how different the various beings at fourth class were. While Malcolm couldn't tear space like the Emperor, the destruction he caused was more lethal. He couldn't help but wonder which of them would win in a fight. Let's get to the most important matter first. Tell me which world you came from and what purpose you arrived here to achieve. Keep in mind that trying to lie in front of me will result in instant death. Damien nodded. He wasn't surprised by the question, nor the fact that he wouldn't be able to lie. The class difference was expansive to the point where even the smallest actions Damien took could be observed by the Emperor precisely. So Damien told the Emperor about Earth and how it had only recently been introduced to Mana, how he ended up trapped in a dungeon, and how he arrived on the surface. The Emperor listened with a passive expression, but inwardly he was feeling complicated. He saw no lies in Damien's words, but that made things more confusing. How can a beginner world produce a talent that can rival even my daughter? It had to be known that it had been tens of thousands of years since Aparin was introduced to Mana. Those born in this world would naturally have better talent than those in new worlds until a few generations passed. Not to mention the fact that the Adelaire royal family was the progeny of two demigods, which further elevated their talent. The Emperor stayed silent. He had seen the close relationship between the two kids long before they had actually gotten together, even back when they first met. He had been evaluating Damien ever since then. And no matter how he tried to look for faults, he couldn't find anything to warrant rejecting Damien's relationship with his daughter. He was talented enough to not burden her. His character was outstanding, and he never seemed to move based on his lust, and his decision-making was good enough to pass. Though Damien had plenty of flaws, they were things that could be fixed with time. He was still young, after all. The Emperor's only qualm was Damien's background, but even that didn't seem to be an issue. He was smarter than to be hostile to every otherworlder simply because of the Nox, especially when the other world had the potential to birth talents like Damien even while it was in its infancy. I will not stand in the way of your relationship with my daughter, but there are certain things you must do in order to keep that relationship. I will speak to you about that when she returns to the room. Damien smiled brightly, but realized there was another topic he had to bring up. Senior, we need to talk about the Nox. Chapter 84, Meeting 3. The Emperor's eyes became serious as Damien narrated his and Rose's experience within the temple. Although he already knew the story from his ancestral teachings, he had never seen the Nox in person. He was born 500 years ago when the demigods of Aparin had all died out. Hearing Damien's description of the Nox, he fell into thought. Damien had long decided to share this information with Rose's father. From her explanation yesterday, he gathered that although he was soft on her, he was a shrewd individual and a cunning old fox when it came to politics. He was also someone that genuinely cared for the well-being of his empire. Someone with this type of personality was someone Damien wanted to build a solid relationship with. If he was most lacking in a single area, it would be politics. He hated all the tricks and schemes that came with it and the mental battles that were fought. He'd much rather take to the front lines, and allow someone else to deal with political nonsense for him. But he knew he needed to become more cunning. He figured he'd just learn as time passed, but maybe he could gather a few tricks from the Emperor. The Emperor slowly collected his thoughts before nodding. "Let me worry about this for now. You and Rose are young, so you should gain strength in preparation for the inevitable war." Damien agreed. As they wrapped up their conversation, the Emperor called Rose back into the room. "Father," Rose said with anxiety evident on her face. Seeing her like this made the Emperor slightly drop his indifferent facade. She was the type who always charged into danger without worry for the consequences, and now she was looking at him like a little girl again. He couldn't help but be reminded of fond memories from her childhood. Even though he didn't have much time to raise her properly, he did his best to be a good father. "It's a rare occasion to see you flustered like this," he teased before getting a sudden idea. He made a quick signal to Damien before continuing. And Damien naturally understood what the Emperor wanted to do. It was just surprising that he would suddenly have a complete switch in the serious persona he had been projecting this entire time. "I will not approve of this relationship. He is not worthy of you," the Emperor said, his indifference returning. When Rose looked over at Damien, she saw the pained look on his face. When he saw her watching him, he seemingly averted his eyes in shame. Rose began panicking. This wasn't how she imagined things to go. After all, the two of them had very similar personalities at the core. Did they fight? Was there a disagreement? Seeing her get so flustered made it impossible to stay in character. Basically at the same time, both the Emperor and Damien broke out into raucous laughter. Rose's gaze switched between the two of them as her confusion slowly turned into anger. Why you?" Since she couldn't do anything about her father, she went straight for Damien. "You'll pay for this." Damien gave a light smile towards the Emperor before running out of the throne hall, followed by an angry Rose. The Emperor stared at their receding backs with a slight smile on his face. They truly reminded him of his relationship with his first wife, Rose's mother. Thinking of her only brought pain and longing to his heart. He had long since killed the ones responsible for her death, and he had made sure to do it with his own hands, but he felt it wasn't enough to avenge her. The only reason he didn't continue his rampage and eradicate the families that were implicated was due to the nature of Rose's mother. She was a kind woman who didn't like to find fault in anyone. If she knew what he had done, she would never forgive him. Sighing, he disappeared from the room. When his figure reappeared, he was in a certain room in the castle. In front of him were a small bed, a tea table, and a garden that didn't lose its luster even in the 10 years since its owner had passed. He walked forward to the grave that was made in the middle of this room. It was where she had asked to be buried when she died, so he had followed her wish. "Agata, sometimes it's surprising just how accurate your predictions could be. Not only did our daughter grow powerful, but that person also arrived. He's just a young man that our daughter has fallen in love with, but his entrance into her life has already begun to change her destiny. Do you know that she's already a third class? And from her aura, she is much stronger than those at her level. Yet that boy is even stronger than her." The Emperor let out a slight chuckle. "He faced me fearlessly even with our level difference, and even Malcolm told me of how the boy did the same when he was only at second class. Although it still hurts to give our daughter away to that kid, I will follow her and your will. You never let me astray before, and I refuse to believe you do it now." The main reason he didn't have a problem with Damien and Rose's relationship was that he already knew it would happen before they even met. His first wife had predicted it all. After all, how could eyes like Rose's just randomly show up? She had inherited it from her mother, though she wasn't aware of this. The Emperor stayed within this room for a bit longer before he once again vanished from his place. Meanwhile, Damien and Rose had already finished their small game of tag and were happily chatting within the palace. "Let's stay here for a few more months before we head back," Damien said. "I learned about many of my weaknesses earlier, and I'd like to take some time to fix them and experiment with my new power." Rose nodded. She needed to get used to the gains she received from the obelisk as well. Although there weren't as many clear changes in her status as with Damien, there were more intrinsic changes that she felt she needed to tap into. Not to mention that she also had a set of question marks in the affinity section of her status. And so, the two of them began to train diligently. Damien focused mainly on his lightning, trying to get more use out of it than he previously could, while also experimenting with his new powers. The power of starlight was extremely unique, and Damien wanted to learn how to efficiently use it without draining all of his mana. Not only that, he wanted to be able to cast his skills and spells instantly, rather than needing to concentrate as he did previously. Every second wasted in battle could lead to his potential death. He had only tried to use Sunfire so far, not experimenting with any other uses of starlight. So, he needed a good amount of time to learn. Rose was similar. She had gained many insights into both illusion and wind, but she focused more on her illusions. She had gained tomes containing years of research of the creator of the Legacy Tomb, but had yet to dive into this knowledge. She spent her time assimilating this new knowledge and turning it into her own, gaining insights on improving her illusions. Besides the tomes, she also spent time learning to properly use her new illusory throne skill. If she could raise her illusions to Grandmaster level control, while already having an understanding of how to use her domain, she could empower this skill by leagues. Zara, who was feeling a bit like a third wheel to these two, had made her way to the Helia Forest to train within the beast domain. Although she was most comfortable by Damien's side, she knew her priorities. Not to mention that the two's mental connection would still be active, so she didn't need to be worried. Damien currently stood in the middle of an open field as he tested a move he'd been wanting to create ever since he gained a spatial affinity. It was a badass move that he had always wanted to try. Closing his eyes and concentrating, Damien felt the makeup of the atmosphere and outer space that was past it. He felt the large number of celestial bodies that existed within that expansive darkness. And then he pulled. He knew exactly what he was doing and did it with all his power. And the result, a massive crater tens of kilometers both wide and deep was formed. Damien smiled like a fool seeing this. The devastation was leagues above what he'd been able to do with his previous power level, and he was extremely proud of himself. Damien quickly closed his eyes as he tried to do it once more. He needed to perfect this move before his return. And like that, 6 more months passed. Damien, Rose, and Zara stood in the middle of a massive clearing far away from any civilization. They had already talked with the Emperor and gotten his consent for their plans, so they moved without pause. Staring at the expansive sky above him, Damien let out a heavy sigh. It's been 4 years. It's finally time to return home. Feeling his emotions, Rose and Zara came close and showered him with warmth. Lightly smiling, he raised his hand. The ground in front of the trio twisted and warped. A massive portal was in the process of forming. Chapter 85, Memories 1. Earth 2055. It had been 10 years since Earth had awakened to mana, and civilization had changed to the point where it would be unrecognizable by those of the previous era. Mana had led to the advent of many new technologies and products that both advanced everyday living and the race as a whole. The first 5 or so years were spent acclimating to the new world, but the latter 5 were filled with development. Humanity was a race that was always quick to learn and develop once they had gotten a grasp on their situation. Their biggest strength was to adapt, and adapt they did. Many futuristic things one would only imagine to be in sci-fi movies were normalized in the past 5 years. Even flying cars had been invented, though they were only available for purchase to the highest echelon of society, being difficult to produce. Besides technology, society had also made massive developments, though whether these were good or bad were unknown. Earth had become one with its imagination. When second class started to become more common, many organizations popped up with various purposes. But order needed to be maintained. Going with a concept they already knew, humanity split into a world filled with heroes and villains. 3 years ago, a mysterious phenomenon occurred. A bright light enveloped the entire planet, momentarily blinding its people. The source of this light and its implications were unknown at the time, but many strange individuals began appearing out of the woodworks. Although their numbers were only in the tens, these individuals possessed strength that surpassed those of anyone on the planet. These were the people who now ran the organizations in charge of heroes and villains. Their true purpose was unknown, but it was clear that there were two sides among these people. The ones who led the heroes had a righteous air, seemingly disdaining any lowly action, while the ones who led the villains always carried greed in their eyes, succumbing to their desires. The diametrically opposed individuals began gathering forces and humanity was split between them. It was unknown who they were or where they came from, but people didn't care. The common populace wanted order, which the Hero Association, titled Asgard, was providing them. Meanwhile, those who desired chaos or desired sin drifted towards the villain society, Niflheim. Heroes and villains were at constant war with each other, but on the surface, the world remained peaceful. Gates continued to generate and heroes took care of them, earning the worship of the people. Meanwhile, villains either acted as petty criminals or attempted to make grand schemes. Power was obtained easily through massacre, and it got to people's heads. They proclaimed themselves gods and did as they pleased, at least until they were caught. But as mentioned before, leveling required death. There was no righteous message about how killing was bad or how villains should be captured. That would be pure idiocy. Any villain that was caught would be killed where they stood, and any hero unfortunate enough to meet someone more powerful than them would die a meaningless death. Even the previously standing guild association had been swallowed in this conflict, becoming one with Asgard. Those that didn't agree with Asgard's ruling either quit entirely or joined Niflheim. It was currently August. The winds ushered in the fall season and leaves began to brown. A certain blue-haired girl walked through a park and admired the scenery. Alina had been spending most of her time in Gates for the last 4 years, only seeing the changes of society when she took breaks like she was doing now. She had no idea how things progressed this way so suddenly, but she knew it was suspicious. However, she was no hero, nor was she a villain. She simply gained strength in secret while living an average life in public. If she ever saw someone acting up or killing civilians, she wouldn't stand by and do nothing. But she didn't make an active effort to save people. It had been 4 years since Damien was thrown into the dungeon, and it had been 2.5 since Alina had destroyed Jin's legacy. Ever since that day, he had left her alone. Rather, it was rare to see him enter the public eye for a few months. After that, Jin went and became a hero. He took a hero name, calling himself Night Chaser, and fought villains and Gates, gaining the love of the public. He was one of what people called the pillars of humanity, some of the strongest people alive. These were the people who both did the most for the fight against villains and the closing of Gates. Still, Alina didn't bother with him. As long as he didn't chase her, she didn't care what he did. She had already sentenced him to death, and that was because even after all these years, she still held hope that Damien would return. She had felt the existence of that faint ethereal thread, that feeling that connected them. It had been ever present through the years and stood tall as her beacon of hope. Even she called herself irrational for thinking this way, but she couldn't help herself. She tried to forget, she tried to kill her emotions, she tried to move on, but as long as that ethereal string existed in her consciousness, she couldn't. She believed that he was on the other end of that string. So she had spent the last 4 years taking care of his mother, unceasingly moving with the goal of staying on his level when he returned. This was also the reason she didn't bother with Jin. When Damien returned, wasn't Jin dated to die? And like that, she had reached level 90, infinitely close to becoming third class. Alina sat on a park bench as all these thoughts came back to her. While she did occasionally think about everything, there was a specific reason this time. It had been 7 years since high school had ended, and a reunion had been planned for those in her grade. It was an awkward number for a reunion, but since it was 10 years since the World Awakening, they decided to hold it anyway. She was only 21 this year, meaning she graduated high school at 14, but this was relatively normal. The standard of education had been raised worldwide in the 2030s, and a steeper learning curve was implemented. Most people graduated high school at 15, but she and Damien were at the younger end of the spectrum, leading to them turning 15 only after graduation. Thinking about high school, Alina sighed. Those days were good memories for her, but at the same time, they were painful. Her first meeting with Damien was in high school, but she had to sit and watch him get bullied without the ability to help. Even if she tried to help, he would always reject, saying he didn't want to owe any favors. This was always his attitude, and it only became more pronounced after he awakened as someone weak. Even though the bullying became worse, he simply took it silently and continued his life. Alina admired this quality of him more than he could imagine. His will to survive through everything without batting an eye was something she wished she had, but at the same time, she thought it was a flaw he needed to fix. Not the fact that he could survive, rather the part where he tried to do it all alone. It was this quality that slowly started turning her platonic feelings into something more. She watched him power through everything and decided to do whatever she could to help. So, she did her best to make every moment they spent together a happy memory. And in this quest, she slowly fell for him. For his determination, for the kindness he had towards those who earned it, and for the dominant self that he showed only around her. Alina shook her head. She was supposed to be deciding whether to attend the high school reunion, but she ended up daydreaming about Damien again. She couldn't help it, since she associated her happy high school life with memories of his face. Thinking about the reunion, Alina couldn't yelp but sigh again. It would be filled with people who used to bully Damien and try to peer pressure her into dropping him as her friend. It was filled with vile girls who used to spread rumors behind people's backs to ruin their lives, and annoying boys who would always look at her lustfully and openly brag about trying to hook up with her. And the worst part was that, with the advent of the new society, most of these people developed her complexes. They thought of themselves as defenders of justice and would probably use that standing to elevate their egos. But she still decided to go in the end. She felt it was a moral obligation she had. Not to mention, there was a single person she wanted to see. It was a teacher that she had back in her sophomore year of high school named Allison Clark. She was the only person who had stood up for her during those days. Alina had confided in her about what was happening with Damien, and it was this teacher who gave her the idea to make every moment she could into a happy memory. From that point, she began talking to Allison almost on a daily basis and treated her more like an older sister than a teacher. Sadly, they drifted apart after graduation since Alina joined the guild and was constantly busy doing work for them. For the sake of meeting the sole person other than Damien that she enjoyed talking to during high school, she would go to the reunion. And so, Alina stood up from the park bench where she sat and made her way over to the school. Chapter 86, Memories 2. With her speed and stamina as a peak second class, it didn't take long for Alina to reach the school. Looking at the large two-story building once again made her reminisce, but she shook off her thoughts and headed inside. She was about an hour late to the reunion and hadn't bothered to dress up, wearing a simple shirt and jeans, but she still gathered a great deal of attention when she walked in. It was to be expected from someone who could objectively be titled as one of the most beautiful women on earth. Still, Alina didn't pay them any attention. She simply grabbed some food for herself and walked to a corner, silently looking out for the only person she came to meet. On her way, she heard the usual conversations about occupations and how people's lives went after they graduated, but it was different from a normal reunion. After all, their main topics were classes and levels, and also their lives working for Asgard and other smaller organizations that were under it. But Alina could feel it in the air. None of these people truly cared about how the others were doing. They were just here to brag. While Alina attempted to mind her own business, it didn't quite work out for her. Slowly but surely, a group of people formed around her, most of them being men. "Hey, did you know that I'm in the top 100 of the hero ranking?" The guys tried to brag, but Alina disdained them all. The hero ranking was true to its name. It ranked all active heroes based on their power levels and contribution. But the true experts of society didn't care about these. Alina was one of them, so obviously she knew this. And it wasn't just the one guy trying to impress her. Rather, they were all competing for who was the coolest among them, making them look like a group of fools. The gathering of people attracted others, and the group became more diverse, with everyone speaking of their rankings or the current news about Niflheim, until one man started making his way over. This man was leagues above the others in terms of appearance, and a single smile from him made most of the girls turn red. He walked to the front of the group with confidence as he flashed a smile. "How have you been, Alina?" "Bryce," Alina responded with a dull tone. She wasn't impressed in the slightest, nor did she want to continue interacting with him. Bryce was one of the main culprits of Damien's bullying in the past, and he had never ceased trying to make moves on her. He was basically the second coming of Jin, and it was clear how that ended. "How has your life been? I'm sure you've been missing me since we last talked," Bryce said with a wink. The insinuation he was making made plenty of single women angry, but he didn't seem to notice. But Alina didn't care to play his games. "We haven't even talked once since high school ended. Not to mention that even in high school you just followed me like a dog no matter how much I tried to get rid of you." Bryce's face twitched, but he kept his smile. "Come on, don't be like that. Don't you know that I'm a top-ranking hero now? They call me Silver Flash. How could you not like me after all these years?" As if he got a sudden idea, Bryce's face lit up. "Ah, could it be that you're still caught up on that trash? He's dead now anyway, so why do you even care so much?" The mention of Damien made the whole crowd start whispering to each other. News of his death had been published in many newspapers, but nobody seemed to care because of Jin's status. Naturally, these classmates of his had seen those articles. "Ah, that lame kid. I was wondering if he died off or something, and it turns out I was right." "Yeah, totally. Even seeing that trash breathe next to me was disgusting." Alina was slightly stunned. She didn't know how the vileness of these classmates was exposed simply at the mention of Damien. It's like they all dropped their facades and talked trash about him at any opportunity they could get. Bryce smiled at this. He was influential enough to spread rumors and information that people would take at face value, not bothering to investigate deeper. Out of sheer spite for that kid who had taken the attention of the woman he wanted, he spread some dirt on Damien's name. The classmates continued to talk trash, unaware of the monster they were awakening. That is, until a suffocating pressure exploded from Alina's body. Her deep blue eyes became midnight black, devoid of any feeling. "Talk like that about him one more time. I dare you." Bryce, who was nearest to her, suffered the worst from the pressure. He had only recently become a second class, and his position in Asgard was not earned but bought. He coughed blood, struggling to keep his consciousness from collapsing. He felt humiliated and couldn't stop himself from trying to get the last laugh. "Cough, no matter what you do, it doesn't change the fact that he's dead." He laughed, seeing the rage on Alina's face. He truly felt good putting her down like this, but his smile froze in the next instant. Swish. It took a moment to process, but by the time it did, the event was already over. Blood spurted wildly, and a severed arm dropped to the floor. "Let's call this arm as compensation. Never talk like you are above me again." Potions strong enough to regrow limbs didn't exist on Earth yet. The advent of Hero Society had brought potions enough to heal flesh wounds, but Earth still needed time to develop anything more complex. Without another word, Alina walked off. The crowd parted for her as she left, everyone seemingly in fear of what she'd do next. As Alina walked away, she finally spotted Allison in the corner. Smiling lightly, she walked over to have a much-needed reunion. Back within the crowd, Bryce was furious. The pain helped him keep his head clear, but even in a clear-headed state, his thoughts were maddening. "I'll make that bitch pay." Hours passed as Alina chatted with Allison, the other partygoers avoiding her like the plague. They talked about how their lives had been and their plans for the future, and many other things. When Damien was brought up, Allison learned about Elena's irrational belief that he was still alive, but she was powerless to do anything about it. All she could do was wish Elena well, hoping her mental state would recover. Suddenly, someone rushed into the venue with a panicked look on their face. "Turn a TV on right now. It doesn't matter what channel, just do it now." There was indeed a TV in the hall, but nobody had paid it much mind before. However, hearing the urgency in the man's voice, they did as he said. Every channel was showing the same news. Breaking news. In the skis above Los Angeles, a massive gate has appeared. Its rating has been determined as SSS rank. This is an emergency situation, and Asgard is calling for the evacuation of all civilians in the city. Heroes are being requested to rendezvous at the site no matter their rank. A massive gate was shown on the screen. However, there was a major difference between it and any other gate that had appeared before. It was entirely purple on its edges, while the middle was an abyssal black. Badum badum. Elena didn't know why, but her heart started racing. Her breathing quickened as she felt that ethereal string become slightly thicker than before. Is it him? Without another thought, she rushed to the scene. She was followed by all the other heroes within the class, as an Asgard summon wasn't something they could reject. Even the now single-armed Bryce was making his way over. They were relatively close to the center of the city, and they could see the massive gate from where they stood. It was around the diameter of a soccer stadium. The ominous portal floating in the air, combined with the sight of countless civilians fleeing for their lives, truly painted an apocalyptic picture. It wasn't long before Elena reached the area near the gate. Since she wasn't part of Asgard, she could watch from nearby without being noticed. Countless heroes had gathered in the square. Elena could even see Jin standing at the forefront with a valiant look on his face. She snorted at this and turned her attention back to the gate. And slowly, she witnessed it open. Along with the other 500 or so heroes who had responded to Asgard's call, Elena saw something insane. A huge body taller than many four-story buildings, and with length to match. A pair of beautiful wings that eclipsed the sun, forcing those below into darkness, and a pair of piercing golden eyes that looked down upon them in disdain. It was the biggest beast any of them had ever seen, and its aura was just as suffocating as the leaders of Asgard and Niflheim. The massive wolf was the only thing that emerged from the gate, with it closing directly after the wolf descended. But this didn't bring any solace to those on the ground. They could feel that even alone, this beast could raze the city and kill them without batting an eye. In their fear of the beast, the mass of heroes failed to notice another detail. But Elena didn't. She was on high alert for the faint possibility that her dreams would come true. And so she saw it. Standing atop the beast was a tall man that completely contrasted the figure she remembered so well. Yet, she knew without a shadow of a doubt. Damien had returned. Chapter 87, Return 1. Damien could only smile wryly at Zara's love for big entrances. Knowing they were returning to Damien's home, she decided to go grand. When the portal opened, the sheer size had startled Damien and he decided to be Loki, but his idea was immediately rejected. And so, the trio entered the portal with Zara in her true form. The sensation of a portal was vastly different from his usual warps. It was like they were traveling through a long, dark passage that continued with no end. Zara simply flew forward with the current of mana until they reached the circular exit. And exiting was different too. They were forced to wait for a few hours before the ethereal film covering the portal disappeared. It made sense, though. The portal was created using Damien's connection with Earth as a medium, so it would naturally need time to form. It turned out to be more like a gate than a normal portal, but Damien still hadn't grasped exactly how gates functioned. And he couldn't really be blamed for this since he hadn't seen one in 4 years. And so after a few hours of wait, they descended. The first thing that entered Damien's vision was the vast array of skyscrapers that yearned to touch the sky. Various cars moving in every direction seemingly running away from the gate. and a crowd of people underneath him with their weapons prepared. Thinking about it, Damien realized that this was a normal response that they would have to a massive gate appearing, but he didn't care. Now that he was back, there were a few things he needed to accomplish before he relaxed and learned how Earth had changed in his absence. And he saw one of those things at the very forefront of the crowd. Zara slowly landed on the ground as she looked down on those heroes before her. Compared to Damien, they were utter trash, and she couldn't understand how they were born from the same world that created him. Meanwhile, Rose was feeling something entirely different. She had completely disregarded the crowd as her eyes darted around at the technological landscape around her in fascination. She had heard of skyscrapers and cars from Damien, but seeing them in person was a different story. Just like any normal person, Rose had never left the world she was born in. She was experiencing a pretty severe case of culture shock. The heroes stared at the three in trepidation. At first, they were terrified of the massive beast that had descended from the gate, but now their fear had multiplied. They had finally noticed the two people standing atop such a beast and realized that they must be stronger than it to have the capability to tame it. Damien then jumped off of Zara's back, leaving Rose to admire the sights as he walked up to the heroes. "You come here," he said as he pointed to a man in the front. Although his appearance had matured since the last time they met, and he was wearing some sort of stupid costume at the moment, the blonde-haired, green-eyed man was someone Damien would never forget. When Jin saw that he was being singled out from the crowd, he straightened his back haughtily. Even with his manhood gone, he still had his pride as a top expert of humanity. "HMPH, you dare call me like that, fiend?" Jin said, his words reeking a misplaced sense of justice. But Damien wasn't having it. "Shut up and come here obediently before I force you to do so." He wanted to humiliate Jin before killing him. This was the only reason he hadn't struck yet. Before anything else could happen, a suffocating pressure descended on the environment. "What are you doing, boy?" Damien calmly turned his gaze up towards the old man who had just arrived on the scene. "I'm repaying old debts, old man. The better question is, why do you think you're qualified to know?" He was unfazed by the old man's pressure. He was at most at the middle stages of third class, but that meant nothing to Damien. Even if he couldn't touch a fourth class, only those at the higher and peak stages of third class were his match. But the old man didn't seem to like his attitude. "You dare speak to me like that? Very well, let me educate you on how to respect your elders." The old man struck his hand out, creating a palm phantom that charged towards Damien. It was entirely made of mana, but contained traces of fire element within it. Damien sighed, but he figured the best way to showcase the difference in strength was to do nothing. The massive palm phantom arrived in front of him, but was promptly reduced to nothingness by Damien's vector field. "Who are you?" the old man said as he witnessed this scene. He never thought he'd meet someone stronger than him other than the ones he had come with. "That shouldn't matter to you. Either step aside or lose your life." The old man was stuck in a dilemma. He didn't know if he could last against Damien, but the one he was aiming for was too talented to let go. The old man decided to gain Damien's sympathy. "Listen, boy. That young man you are targeting is one of the main hopes of the human race. Without him, plenty of chaos will ensue and innocents will die. The villains are getting brasher and brasher by the day, and we need every bit of manpower we can get. I cannot allow you to harm one of our most talented heroes." The terms hero and villain were new to Damien, but he wasn't too surprised by the direction the world was taking. He had just come from a true fantasy world, so seeing the superhero society of Earth didn't affect him much. Seeing that Damien was unfazed, the old man tried once more to persuade him. "There are major threats incoming that only a few people know about. Your actions could cause the deaths of millions of people if you don't act carefully. Choose righteousness and don't succumb to vile emotions." Damien finally got ticked off. "Old man, don't bullshit me with your talks of righteousness. Do you think I can't see your true ambitions? Those people are not my concern. You should be happy that I'm sparing an outsider like you in the first place." Both the heroes in the vicinity and the general public watching through the news feed were shocked by his words. Millions of deaths were mentioned, but he didn't care. They immediately labeled him a villain. And while they didn't pay much attention to the word outsider, it was what shocked the old man the most. He knew precisely what Damien was talking about. Probably the most shocked of them all was Elena, who was still watching from a distance. The previous Damien wouldn't throw away countless lives like that. He's changed. But she felt it was inevitable. She couldn't imagine what he had to go through after he was betrayed, and she felt he was completely justified in seeking revenge. Plus, the loss of Jin wouldn't even mean that much as long as someone took his place, and she could fulfill that role if she wished. Suddenly, the wind whooshed by her face and a beautiful girl appeared next to her. "It's good that your opinion of him hasn't changed. I'd be disappointed if it was that easy to sway you." Alina looked at the girl with shock. The girl had shoulder-length pink hair and goldish ruby eyes, even matching her in beauty. "Who are you?" she said with vigilance, but all she got in return was a mischievous giggle. "I'm that guy's woman." While the first meeting between two of the people Damien cared for most in this life was taking place, the drama continued on his side. He proceeded to ignore the old man's ramblings as he looked back at Jin. "Did you become a dumb bitch in the 4 years it's been since we've seen each other? Or was becoming dickless what pushed you over the edge?" This infuriated Jin, but he had seen how Damien dealt with the old man's attacks. He didn't dare move irrationally. "Who are you?" "Well, that question seems to be pretty popular today. How sad that you don't remember me. After all, you pushed me into the dungeon with your own 2 hands. Did you sentence so many people to death that you forgot their faces?" These words shook Jin to his core. Although it was true that he had abandoned a relatively large number of people in dungeons, only one came to mind when he looked into those indifferent eyes. "Why you are that trash?" Damien shook his head with a sarcastic, pained expression on his face. "Trash? Sigh, it looks like I'll have to remind you of my name. I'm done with this farce. Remember me in your next life. My name is Damien Void." This announcement caused waves of shock to ripple through the crowd, who had already retreated after the old man released his palm shadow. Many of them were part of the group of classmates he had gone to high school with, after all, and they were just talking trash about how it was good that he died. Suddenly, Damien's voice resounded through the area. "Starfall." At first there was no reaction. It was eerily silent, as if the calm before the storm. But slowly, the temperature in the area began rising. Sensing danger, even the old man retreated to the crowd, protecting them with a barrier. Only Jin was left in place, bound by Damien and unable to move. The temperature became unbearable as Damien spoke his last words to Jin. "It's your misfortune to have messed with me." A shadow blotted out the sky. It wasn't a beast or anything similar, but a massive rock that was hurling towards their position. As the meteor passed through the atmosphere, it caught fire due to its sheer speed. Jin could only watch the scene with horror evident in his eyes. The heat penetrated his body. His skin began to melt, followed by his muscles and organs, but the superior regeneration he possessed forced him to stay alive. He couldn't even scream in pain due to the restrictions placed on him, but he truly wished he could. It was agonizing. And then, under the horrified eyes of the millions of people who watched through their TV screens and the crowd that had gathered under the gate, the flaming meteor landed on Jin's position. BOOM. Chapter 88, Return to. The fact that they were in the middle of a city only served to make the devastation more pronounced. Buildings crumbled into pieces, and the ones closest to the impact site completely disintegrated. The ground caved, and even the subway system underneath it was destroyed. As for Jin, not even a shred of his clothing remained intact. Damien would never take innocent lives with his own 2 hands. The only reason he was bold enough to act in such a way was that he had already confirmed that the vicinity was clear of civilians. As for the heroes who were watching from the distance, they were saved from the aftershocks by the old man's barrier. Well, all but one of them. The idiot named Bryce that had caused Damien so much trouble was inadvertently killed by the residual impact of his attack. It wasn't a matter of coincidence, rather it was Bryce's own idiocy that killed him. He had refused to hide behind the barrier after learning that the man in front of them was Damien. His denial of the truth caused him to die a meaningless death. Damien gazed at the destruction with a profound look on his face. He felt something within him dance with joy while the area around him was destroyed, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. Damien was satisfied that he had finally received reparations for the events of the past, and the truth is, he had been waiting for this moment. If one thought back to the previous 4 years, Damien had never killed another human being. It could be argued that he killed the first third class he met back on Aparin, but that man ultimately died by Zara's hands. It wasn't out of some misplaced sense of justice or due to a strong moral compass. It was much pettier than that. Damien wanted the first human he killed to be Jin. He saved that spot for the man who both caused him to endure immense suffering and gain equally immense benefits. Specifically for this purpose, Damien had refrained from making any enemies in the past 4 years. And he really didn't feel anything about the fact that he had killed another human. It was a bit too late for Damien to feel an existential crisis or question himself for something as small as this. How much had he slaughtered over the last 4 years? How many lives had he taken? After growing close with Zara, he didn't view beasts as simple fodder anymore. This feeling increased when he met Ethan and the Beast Empress. They were all beasts or descended from beasts, but they were no different from humans. Beasts at third class even had matching or superior intellect compared to average humans, so why would he consider them as inferior beings? Damien's mentality was largely apathetic to others, especially his enemies. Killing was simply the way of the world. The beast half of him wholeheartedly believed this, and his human half resonated with it as well. Whether or not his actions were the right choice, he didn't care. If what he did today came back to bite him as consequences in the future, he'd deal with those consequences. He didn't care in the slightest for the lives of people who weren't close to him. Jin had to die. That was that. What was happening on Earth was a separate matter. Damien took a slight glance at the old man once more before speaking. "I'm sure we'll meet again." He called Zara, who had shrunken enough to not cause mayhem, and hopped on her back. However, he soon found that there was an extra passenger. When he turned around, he saw not one but 2 beautiful girls looking back at him. One of them had a sly smile on her face, while the other was trying her best to hold back her tears. Gazing at the familiar blue-haired beauty in front of him, Damien had to admit that he missed her. He knew his feelings had intensified due to the Legacy Tomb trial, but even without that he still missed her. He had thought about it before they returned. He felt it was unfair to Alina that his feelings sprouted for a fake version of herself. No matter how realistic the illusion was, in the end, it was still an illusion. So, he spent some time getting rid of those intrusive feelings. But even without them, he still missed her. Only after seeing her in front of him once more did he realize how true this was. "Long time no see," he said with a smile. "How have you been?" Damien's words were light, but it was enough to break Alina's last shred of resistance. She jumped forward and hugged him as tight as she could. Damien also reciprocated, glad to see his friend after many years of separation. When Damien was taking care of Jin's matter, Alina had talked with Rose about the past 4 years. Although Rose left most of the details for Damien to explain himself, she did make sure to mention that they were together. And Alina immediately felt downcast about it. She had waited 4 years harboring her feelings for him, but he had come back with a woman by his side already. But she couldn't accept it. Even if she knew in her heart that it was the truth, she still couldn't accept it. And being the woman she is, her competitive nature flared. Even if Damien had a woman already, it didn't mean she couldn't stay with him. Even if it wasn't a romantic relationship, they were still best friends. She would do her best to keep that bond. And so she hugged him with all her strength. She didn't want him to leave her again. Rose watched with a slight smile on her face as this happened. She felt like teasing her first love rival, so she didn't mention anything about the concept of harems simply to see what happened, and she wasn't disappointed. Alina had told her about her determination to stay at Damien's side as his best friend, and Rose had happily accepted. Let's see how long she can suppress her feelings. I say it'll be 6 months at most. After a good 10 minutes that Alina spent silently crying into Damien's chest, the two of them separated as they began to talk. Damien naturally glossed over his time in the dungeon and mostly explained his travels in Aparin, while Alina told him of her dungeon adventures and the changes on Earth. As they talked, Zara continued to fly until they finally reached the destination of Damien's second and most important matter on Earth. It was something he didn't want to delay in the slightest. It was time to heal his mother. They arrived at the hospital silently, and Damien entered his mother's room through its window, while the girls waited patiently for him outside. When he arrived, he ended up staring at the familiar face he hadn't seen in many years. It was a face he dearly missed, and since Alina had been consistently paying her hospital bills, she looked the exact same as the last time he'd seen her. With tears in his eyes, Damien spoke, "Mother, your son has finally returned." He took one bottle of elixir out of his inventory and carefully began pouring it into her mouth. There would usually be some sort of problem or responsibility that prevented him from curing her so fast, but Damien wasn't the type to care about any of that. He had moved with this main goal for the past 4 years, even if he had sidetracked slightly, so why would he delay it when he already had the opportunity? It would be utterly stupid if he even considered prioritizing anything else, especially after the illusion trial. As he poured the elixir down her throat, he gently injected his mana into her body to help her process its effects. She was still in a coma, so she wouldn't even be able to swallow on her own. The last thing Damien wanted was to accidentally kill her due to carelessness. He put his utmost concentration into maximizing the effects of the elixir, losing track of everything else around him. Time passed quickly, and after 10 minutes, he was finally finished. He stepped back and watched carefully, awaiting the results. However, he was saddened to see no changes. His mother still lay on the bed, as if peacefully sleeping. But if Damien was able to see the changes going on inside her body, his mouth would be gaping wide enough to fit a fist inside. Her organs were strengthened, followed by her bones, muscles, and flesh. Her body reached a level stronger than the average first class. Mana bloomed within, filling every pore of her skin and rejuvenating her system, removing the deficiency that plagued her. The system wasn't lying when it said the effects were more pronounced on mortals. Damien's mother even seemed to age backward, looking in her late 20s rather than the 50 years she had lived. It was clear to see why elixir was considered a heavenly medicine. Damien had closed his eyes, silently waiting for a reaction. Even if he was someone who could kill without batting an eye or cause large-scale destruction on a whim, he was scared stiff at the thought of his mother not waking up. And luckily, his prayers were answered. The preliminary effects of the elixir ended, and stillness returned to the room. In the next instant, her eyelids fluttered and slowly opened. Chapter 89, Return 3. When Claire opened her eyes, she saw herself in an unfamiliar room. The ceiling was tiled, and the bed wasn't as comfortable as the one she was used to, not to mention the various tubes and equipment that were stuck to her body. She felt like she had just woken up from a long sleep, but the dreams she had weren't anything she could be happy about. She had dreamed of her son speaking to her. Although she couldn't see his face, she could feel his distress. He told her about many things such as an energy called mana and a weird new world, and frankly, it all felt like her son had returned to his middle school delusions. But then one day, her son's voice disappeared. Even if it was a dream, it was a long one, and she couldn't help but feel something bad had happened to him. But no matter how she tried to wake up, she couldn't. And then another voice entered her dream. She knew this one since it was the voice of her son's childhood friend. But she seemed to be much older than the last time Claire had spoken to her. She also told Claire tales of this strange world, but she never mentioned Damien. She didn't know how long she had been dreaming, but she desperately wanted to wake up. And finally, when she was able to do so, she was greeted by what she could only assume was a hospital room. The strange thing was that she felt completely fine. Or rather, she felt even better than she did at the peak of her life. Claire slowly sat up and detached the equipment that was holding her down before looking around the room. It was largely empty except for a single person, but seeing this person almost made her faint in shock. Thomas. Damien was shocked by the name that came out of her mouth, and only then did he realize he never knew his father's name. His mother always called him dear or honey, like a movie couple, while Damien never had a reason to call him anything but dad. However, these thoughts were irrelevant. Welcome back, Mom. Damien couldn't stop the tears from flowing. It had been 10 years since his mother had fallen into her coma, and it was an even longer period of time that he had spent without many meaningful interactions with her. By the time he realized how much suffering she put herself through for his sake, she had already fallen into her coma. The sight of a grown man crying was enough to make anyone uncomfortable, but Claire only felt heart-wrenching pain at this moment. She looked at the one who had just called her mom and tried to compare his features to the boy she saw in her memories. The boy had shaggy black hair that only went down to his eyebrows, but this man's hair contained streaks of silver and was slightly past his shoulders. The boy had bright amethyst irises with black pupils that pulled one's gaze like an abyss, but this man's eyes were a swirl of red and that previous amethyst. His cross-shaped pupils shone with starlight and firmness. The boy was short and scrawny. No matter how he tried to grow, he never could. But this man was tall and packed with muscle. She almost couldn't believe that the man in front of her was the same one she had seen before, but she knew it was. She just couldn't fathom the events that had changed her son into his current self. Without her discretion, her tears began to fall as well. Damien couldn't hold himself back anymore. He rushed to his mother and hugged her, making sure to limit his strength. His bodily strength alone could crush her if he wasn't careful. Like a child, he cried in his mother's embrace. And this only increased her pain. She desperately wanted to know what had happened while she was asleep, but it wasn't the time to question him. She could only slowly rub his back and console him as he cried into her bosom. There, everything will be okay. It took many minutes for Damien to calm down before he backed away awkwardly. Now that he had control of his emotions, he was extremely embarrassed by his previous actions. Taking a few deep breaths, Damien started talking. It was important to fill his mother in on how things had changed so her shock wouldn't be too severe when she left the hospital room. Mom, it's been 10 years since you fell into a coma. This sentence was like a bomb that went off in Claire's head. 10 years, what kind of time period was that? But Damien's words weren't over. The world is completely different from how it used to be. An energy called mana bloomed and a system appeared. Just call out the word system in your head and you'll see. Remember how I used to embarrass myself in middle school? Well, I can actually do those things in real life now. As he spoke, he raised his hand, causing lightning to crackle and pop in his vicinity. If Claire was shocked by the display of superpowers, she was bound to be in for more surprises when she followed her son's directions. System. Status. Claire Watson. Human. Female, age 49. Level 1 classless. Experience value 0/100. Title S/A. Affinities Dream. Physique NA. Magic Power 100. SDR 40. AGI 40. Def 40. INT 40. Dex 40. Skills Telekinesis Level 1. Seeing the window in front of her, she was extremely confused. There were a plethora of numbers that she didn't understand, but they seemed to be related to her. Seeing her confusion, Damien spent some time explaining the world awakening and the system to her. As she slowly understood what the numbers meant, she also realized they were only high due to her son's interference. He had told her that he fed her a miracle medicine to heal her, and that it strengthened her to this point. She once again had to wonder what he went through to acquire something like that. But her shock for the day wasn't over. Damien looked through the window for a moment as if he was trying to find something, and suddenly 3 new figures appeared in the room. 2 of them were beautiful women, while the third was a large black wolf. "Mom, you already know Alina, so I don't need to introduce her. This cute one is named Zara and one of my closest friends. You don't need to be scared since she's a lot more innocent than her looks. And finally, this beautiful girl with the pink hair is named Rose, and I guess you could say she's my girlfriend." Damien's introduction was curt, but it got his point across. "Nice to see you again, Auntie." "Hello, Damien's mom." "Hello, Auntie." 3 vastly different greetings followed. Claire was flabbergasted at this point. Alina was expected, but the talking wolf and the other beauty that her son called his girlfriend were totally random to her. In the first place, a talking wolf. She almost fainted just from the absurdity of it, but since her son had already warned her, she had a slightly easier time handling it. Trying to keep her calm, Claire returned their greetings. "Hello, girls. It's nice to meet the people my son cares about so much." She extended her hand and carefully rubbed her fingers through Zara's fur, eliciting an innocent giggle from her. Zara's innocence truly was a heaven-sent gift, as it served as a great way to break the awkward tension that hung in the room. Without any further distraction, the group began talking about the various things that had happened in the past few years, with the topic mostly revolving around Damien. Alina told the story of his hard work before the fall, while Rose told the story of his deeds on Aparin. The mention of another world was yet another shocking occurrence for Claire, but she decided to turn her brain off and listen to the stories. She also learned about the craziness that happened on Earth, and even learned about the raisin manipulator guy that Damien and Alina had jokingly told her about in her sleep. That was such a left-field fact that she remembered it even after waking up from her sleep. It was completely unrelated, but the raisin manipulator had died recently by choking on his own raisins. The death was so stupid that it was on news headlines for a solid week before it died down. Only after this last act of idiocy did people learn that the raisin manipulator was named Anch. The conversation continued as day turned into night, with everyone having smiles on their faces. Damien's fall into the dungeon and recent action of dropping a meteor in the middle of Lowe's, angels were left out of the story, but it'd be fun to see Claire's reaction when she learned of this. But not everyone was as happy as Damien's group. There were many moving in the shadows on Earth for their own goals and purposes. Chapter 90, Schemes 1. In the middle of Lowe's Angels, there was a massive skyscraper that eclipsed all else. Its build was more futuristic, and even the materials used to create it were better than those surrounding it. And the most astounding fact was that this skyscraper was erected in a mere week. This was the headquarters of Asgard, where heroes gathered and those who managed them worked. On the top floor of this building, 3 old men sat around a table. By the solemn atmosphere that surrounded them, it was clear that they were having an important discussion. "Yin Jian, what exactly happened yesterday? You made a fool out of yourself," one of the old men said. His target was a familiar old man that Damien had met not too long ago. "It wasn't my fault. I simply decided to step in and save a promising talent, but who knew that the one I would be facing is stronger than even me?" The other 2 old men had grave looks on their faces. They had seen the broadcast of the event that took place, and they had seen the devastation that was caused. "That boy was too strong. Perhaps only you could take him on, Xiao Zhen." The 2 old men looked at the third among them. He was Xiao Zhen, the strongest of the 3. "No, he is only at the early stages of core formation realm, or what they call third class on this planet. It is simply that his Tao comprehension is advanced enough to allow him to fight a small realm above his cultivation." Yin Jian and the other old man looked at Xiao Zhen in shock. As expected, members of the big clans are a different breed. Not only was he able to gauge the young man's cultivation level, but he had also been able to pinpoint the reason for his strength. This issue should be put on hold for now, as we have more important things to worry about. Chin Huo, how is the progress on the mana gathering arrays proceeding? The third old man replied hastily. The arrays have been set on the appropriate areas across the planet. It shouldn't take long for us to be able to activate the formation. Good. The Jade Heavenly Palace is getting restless. Smaller organizations like our Burning Sun sect are being forced to take the brunt of their emotions. We must hurry and complete our mission on this planet before those from Niflheim beat us to it. Yin Jian suddenly spoke up. Have we figured out the origin world of those fiends? Zhao Zhen could only shake his head. It is still unknown, but the school of study called Norse mythology within this beginner world might be a clue. They took their name from this school immediately, and we only did the same out of convenience. On that note, this world truly is strange, chimed Chin Huo. They even have knowledge similar to our own world, yet it seems to be regarded as fiction by the mortal populace here. The other two nodded. They found that Earth had a variety of cultures and mythology, some of which were eerily similar to other worlds. Yet, they also found that the denizens of Earth did not know about the universe besides their own world. This world truly is strange. Although I reported this to the sect master, he was unbothered. It seems that the pressure from the central continent is becoming too overbearing. Zhao Zhen looked out the window as he sighed. The mortals here are truly interesting. They don't have the mentality of cultivators, but they're still able to make such advancements. It's for this reason that I'm glad those large sects and major clans from the central continent have no plans to ruin this world entirely. It'll merely have a setback of a decade or so. However, that was only if they succeeded. Those at Niflheim didn't seem to possess the same magnanimity. From what they'd seen in the past 3 years, their plans were much more nefarious. Sighing once more, Zhao Zhen came out of his thoughts and looked back at his two colleagues. They were from smaller families, and as such weren't aware of the power structure in the grand scheme of things. Still, they were people he trusted and saw as brothers. Carrying this sentiment in his heart, Zhao Zhen opened his mouth once again. After all, there were still many subjects to discuss. Damien spent the next week in utter relaxation. For the first time in 4 years, he didn't feel the need to constantly train and move towards a purpose. Although he was aware of the Nox threat, he knew it wasn't immediate enough to move ceaselessly without rest. And now that he had finally returned to Earth and done everything he needed to do, he felt unburdened. In short, Damien didn't have anything to drive him anymore. Although he did have an ultimate goal to stand at the peak, it wasn't something that would force him to move. And when Damien realized the comforts of laziness, he eased into it entirely. Currently, Damien was in his old room at his mother's house with the girls. This house wasn't the one he saw in his trial, as they had moved shortly after his dad's disappearance. Still, it was the house he had spent his high school years in, so it brought back memories. With the bodies they had forged through tireless training, everyone in the room had extremely high metabolisms, and the result of this could be seen in the chip bags and snack wrappers that littered the room. As for how they had been spending their days, introducing Rose and Zara to anime, of course. With their daily lives filled with action, the girls especially weren't interested in shonen. Damien was displeased that he couldn't catch up on the new gens that were releasing when he left Earth, but he relented. He was secretly a sucker for slice of life and romantic comedies, so he, begrudgingly, allowed them to watch these genres. Rose was by Damien's side, cuddling up to him while she watched the TV with fascination. Although they had projector screens in Aparin, they didn't have a profession like acting or animation. The entertainment industry was severely lacking. Meanwhile, Alina was using Zara as a pillow and similarly staring at the screen. These two had gotten surprisingly close in the week they had known each other. Zara even let Alina act as she pleased without needing Damien's consent, unlike when she first met Rose. The group dynamic was nice and didn't contain any awkwardness that Damien could feel, so he was happily enjoying his time, unaware of the silent war taking place in his vicinity. After watching anime for a week, Rose had already understood the concept of Japanese harem anime, and since Alina was a native of Earth and Damien's friend for so many years, she did too. The two of them had made a silent agreement that acting in such a chaotic way would be idiotic, to say the least. It might even distract Damien from his goals, which was something neither wanted. Alina had decided to give up on a relationship with Damien ever since she heard he was already taken. After all, she didn't have any dreams of being a homewrecker. Yet, for some unknown reason, Rose always found a reason to mess with her. Even the way she cuddled with Damien at the moment, while seemingly innocent, was something she had done to tease Alina. She was truly enjoying the big sister role that she wanted to take. Even though they wouldn't admit it when asked, and they were asked pretty often by Claire, neither of them would admit they were actually forming a good relationship. They were acting like friends who were so close they argued constantly. The two had been like this all week. They would compete about the smallest things while doing their best not to alert Damien, and the one who, for the front seat view of all this, was naturally Zara. And she had to say that she was enjoying it. She didn't quite understand humans, but basing her assumptions and viewpoint on the anime she had watched in the past week, Zara was having a great time. She still didn't know why they fought like this, but she sensed no ill will between them, making her ignore that question. She even wanted to participate in their stunts sometimes, but sadly she still didn't have a human form. When I reach fourth class and become like the Beast Empress, I'll fight with them too. If either Rose or Alina heard her thoughts, they'd probably burst out laughing, wondering how Zara would react if she knew why they were acting in such a way. Kids, dinner's ready. It wasn't only Damien's group that had seemingly regressed to their teenage years. Claire had joined them as well. It mainly started after she realized how young she looked now. But she had been acting like the mother of young teens, as if trying to make up for the 10 years she had been in her coma. And like that, another 2 weeks passed. It was approaching a month since Damien had returned to Earth, but he was ignoring everything else and lazing around in his house. Chapter 91, Schemes 2. Outside San Francisco, California, there was another base, yet this one looked more typical of a secret hideout. It was within a swampy region that appeared not long after the world awakening. The geography of Earth had gone through various changes, but the most prominent one was the different ecosystems that emerged. Mana had given the world plenty of possibilities for evolution, and it seemed Earth wanted to become closer to nature. Within that swampy region stood a massive dome-like structure. It seemed impractical as a location to hold a large number of people, but that wasn't its purpose. It served to be as inconspicuous as possible. The reason the dome lacked volume was that this particular headquarters drilled deep into the ground, becoming a bunker of sorts. And inside this bunker, there were countless villains. Those who had taken this path were all of various shapes and sizes. They used different methods for power, most of them opting for quick bursts even if they had negative effects in the long term. Some of them didn't even look human anymore, with protrusions exiting their bodies in various places or skin features that made them look like aliens. And the ones who caused these transformations were the 3 men that sat in an isolated conference room within the bunker. The men looked like regular humans at a glance, but this wouldn't be able to fool the stronger beings on Earth. The grotesque features they hid behind those masks were clear to see. "Isaiah, how is progress with those humans?" one of them said. "Good, the peasants from this race are much less civilized than those from the Cloud Plain. They fall into our temptations easily, so it wasn't a hassle at all." The first man nodded. "Good, it's almost time we continue with our main goal. How is progress on that, Weiss?" The third man in the room began talking. "The core extraction process will take more time than initially expected. It seems to have made a connection with another being or object, making it difficult to bring it under us. Haldir, unless we find the source of the connection, we will not be able to proceed as planned." Haldir nodded casually. They weren't pressed on time at all, so he didn't mind a small hindrance. "How is the response of those on Asgard?" "The copy here on Earth is barely a hindrance. They seem keener on keeping the social balance that's stopping us, Kekek, said Weiss. But the true Asgard is increasing the amount of pressure they try to put on us. Their origin planet is moving closer, almost as if they are using it as a vessel for war. Niflheim doesn't currently have the forces nor the strength to compete with them, especially since we've been putting our minds to conquering that cloud plane. The great benefactors also haven't spoken in many years. They only said to prepare and conquer as many worlds as we could before they were ready to move. Isaiah had a thought that he decided to voice out. If the great benefactors wanted us to conquer planets, why are we moving to destroy this one? HMPH, Halder snorted in disdain. What could this tiny planet ever hope to provide the great benefactors? We will use the core energy of this planet to enhance our own, while we conquer the middle worlds. First, we must conquer the cloud plane and Asgard, and then we will continue to even the fabled higher worlds with our grand conquest. All three possessed fervent looks in their eyes at the mention of this. They had only heard stories about higher worlds, but the thought of putting them under their feet was intoxicating. I heard there's a new variable that popped up recently, mentioned Halder as he changed the topic. Indeed, something about a boy and a massive beast that arrived on the planet recently. Still, I have heard that he's weak. He will not hinder our plans, so we can simply ignore him, responded Isaiah. The other two nodded. Their world had advanced more technologically than Aparen or the Cloud Plane. When they arrived on Earth and saw the limited technology and application, they felt repulsed. They even refused to touch these devices lest they stain their hands with filth. These three men were much different than those that came from the Cloud Plane. Their designs for the world were also much more ruthless. Still, it was a plan that they had properly concealed, making those heroes from Asgard disregard their strength. While the various organizations of the world opting to take their time and wait patiently, life on Earth continued with a semblance of peace. It was the same with Damien. After the month passed, he still continued his daily life lazing around, but every once in a while he'd get bored with the monotonous routine. It was truly a great change of pace to do nothing, but after working consistently for 4 years without stopping, he missed the feeling of being pushed and pressured by circumstance. He wanted a new goal. Yet Earth was still too weak to provide him that. Sure, he could go into the gates that opened and slaughter every beast within them, but there was no fun in that anymore. He got tired of dungeons after spending 2 years of his life trapped inside one. To appease his boredom, sometimes he'd ask Rose to disguise him with her illusions, and he'd go fight crime like a wannabe superhero. But even this was losing its spark. It all simmered down to the world being too weak. Damien thought back to the old man he met when he first arrived back on Earth. That old man was a third class, but whatever world he was sent from was able to send him to a beginner world like Earth without qualms. Damien knew what this meant. Third classes must be in abundance in that world. After exiting the temple, Damien had realized that in the grand scheme of things, Aparen was weak as well. It wasn't their fault, rather they had hit a roadblock after the Nox invasion finally ended. Many families that carried talent were wiped out, and plenty of the demigods who died weren't able to have progeny. While the common populace could birth talents as well, the peace the world had settled into had blinded them. There weren't many who felt the drive to improve and stand above everything. Hell, even the geniuses that participated in the Nexus event didn't feel that drive. Damien sensed this clearly, and it was the reason none of them were able to achieve much within the secret realm. Only he, Rose, Ethan, and Matthew had this drive. They all manifested it differently, but all of them desired to stand above the heavens and look down on all creation. Damien sighed. Maybe I should pay a visit to that old fogey and his friends to see what they're up to. If they're enemies, that's great, but if they're friends, I'll have to see what this whole Niflheim nonsense is about. Stretching his body, Damien stood up from the bed. All right, you girls stay here for a bit while I go meet some new friends. Although confused, the girls agreed. It wasn't like they had to accompany Damien everywhere, and he was staying within LA anyway. Being too clingy was something even they found annoying. Just imagining Damien following them everywhere with puppy eyes made them shudder. Well, except for Alina. She had to suppress the sadistic side of her that would absolutely enjoy that. Damien said a quick goodbye to his mother before leaving the house. His destination was obvious, since the massive Asgard skyscraper was clear to see no matter where in the city you were. Let's just walk today. I haven't taken the time to admire the sights. Alina had already done a deeper overview of what had changed on Earth while she was explaining things to his mother, but he still hadn't seen it for himself, nor did he have the chance to appreciate it. He was faster than flying cars and could fly on his own, so there was no point in that. Also, he had graduated from materialistic vanity long ago. Not to mention, he didn't have any money that would be accepted on Earth. Damien walked through the streets of LA calmly. The wind blew in his face and caused his hair to flutter, painting a beautiful picture for the passerbys. With Earth being less developed, Damien's handsomeness ended up standing out more once he arrived. The people in this world weren't used to seeing people who reached his level, and the other third classes were old men. They were appreciated more for their scholarly aura than their looks. His walk was truly like a novel scene. Heads turned at every intersection, and women swooned with hearts in their eyes. Even some men couldn't help but fall for him. The others simply cast him hateful and envious gazes, as even they couldn't help but admit Damien's attractiveness. And Damien thoroughly enjoyed this. It was a rare occasion that he could simply come out like this and bask in glory. He was usually stopping himself from doing so in order to remain humble. As he thought about these things, Damien arrived at his destination. Sighing lightly at the fact that his ego trip had to end, he walked into the building. It was time to differentiate allies from enemies. Chapter 92, Schemes 3. Upon entering the building, Damien was greeted by a large reception hall similar to a hotel. Various chairs and tables were set along its area, and many heroes sat there to chat. There was even a small cafeteria area where restaurant chains had set up branches. Aligned with the back wall, there was an area where the reception desk stood, but instead of just a single receptionist, there were dozens of them lining the entire wall. Each of these receptionists had a queue lined up in front of them. This was to be expected, though, since Asgard wasn't just an American organization, but one that spanned the entire world. They only had a single headquarters where people would come to get inducted as heroes and ranked, while many smaller branches of the organization spanned the globe to manage heroes in their selective countries. Still, this was a centralized organization, and to make sure that the power balance within it wouldn't be disrupted, many official activities were carried out solely within the headquarters. Damien took a minute to admire the sights before joining one of the queues. He didn't consider himself a patient person, but he also wasn't problematic enough to cause a fuss over a little bit of waiting. It took about 2 hours for Damien's turn to finally arrive, but he wasn't bored in his waiting. Returning to Earth also meant returning to technology, specifically cell phones. Damien had made it a priority to get himself a phone during the month he had been relaxing, so he could spend idle time like this listening to music and scrolling through social media apps. Social media was another surprise Damien received. While it was obvious that social media would always be a popular facet on Earth, he didn't expect it to blow so out of proportion. There were countless people who made a living through creative uses of their powers on social media, yet the term influencer didn't quite fit them anymore. The advent of a superpowered world made people's opinions much harder to sway, since status was mainly built on strength nowadays. Anyway, Damien arrived at the desk, where the lady politely greeted him. "Welcome to Asgard headquarters. Are you here to become a hero today, or did you have any special inquiries?" Damien didn't know how to respond. He couldn't just begin the conversation with, "I want to speak to the leaders," or something without sounding like a criminal, but he didn't know how to lead into that topic either. Do you mind telling me what the structure of the higher floors is like?" "Ah, not like physical structure, I mean the people who work there." The lady was a bit suspicious, But after Damien's clarification, she assumed he was thinking about working a desk job in the building, so she answered his questions. Right, the Asgard skyscraper is 200 stories tall, making it the tallest building in the world. And due to this height, there are various facilities available for use. Let's start with the bottom 30 floors. These act as both a testing and training area for heroes. As you know, when a hero wants to join Asgard, they will be tested and assigned a rank that ranges from F to SSS. This rank determines their privileges and the level of activity they are allowed to engage in. The facilities used to test and determine these ranks are present on the first 10 floors. The next 20 floors are filled with various training areas for new or even veteran heroes to use. These were designed specifically by our founders, so their functionality is proven. After that, there are 30 floors that function as a sort of hotel or apartment complex. The people who work in this building sometimes choose to live within it as well, since the entry and exit tend to get crowded on a daily basis. And from there, we get to the more work-related floors. Everything from the 61st floor to the 196th floor is used for logistics and management. Since Asgard is a global organization, things can get hectic without proper order. As for the final 4 floors, I am not allowed to disclose that information, as they are strictly reserved for the founders and those allowed by them. Damien listened to this explanation with slight surprise. The 200 stories seemed unnecessary and simply for vanity purposes, but it looked like they were all put to good use. After all, support staff for every country in the world was bound to take up a lot of space. Still, he didn't know how to feel since the explanation didn't really give him any help. Sighing, Damien decided there wasn't any way to alert them besides causing a scene. Looks like I have to do this the hard way. Miss, with your strength, you'll probably get hurt in what's about to come, so please back up to a safe distance. Damien didn't have any interest in harming civilians, but he made sure to say his words in as strict a tone as he could muster. Feeling suffocated by the invisible pressure Damien was giving off, both the receptionist and those in line behind him backed off. Once they were at a distance Damien deemed safe enough, he fully released his aura as a third class. The entire hall descended into silence. The pressure gripped the hearts of many within the room and instilled fear into their very beings. Nobody knew what Damien wanted, but his actions made him seem like a villain who'd arrived at the headquarters to cause harm. On the top floor of the building, Yin Jian also felt this pressure. Though it didn't suffocate him, he felt it was familiar. Yet, it wasn't the aura of any third class he knew. Unless... Thinking of the possibility, Yin Jian immediately flew off the balcony and descended to the pavement below. It was the easiest way to make it to the ground. Re-entering the building, he saw Damien standing in the middle of the room. "Boy, I don't know why you've come, but I hope it isn't to cause trouble." Damien turned to the sound of this voice and smiled before retracting his aura. "Ah, it's my fault. I wanted to do things the civil way, but I really couldn't think of another way to contact you." The old man sighed helplessly. Indeed, they didn't know each other, so this was the fastest way to elicit a response. He could only marvel at Damien's boldness against the assumptions people would make. "All right, if talking is all you came for, come with me to the top. It's inconvenient to stay here." Yin Jian left and once again began flying to the balcony he came from, and Damien followed him with a light smile on his face. Although Yin Jian was a bit apprehensive, he felt that with his other 2 companions together, they wouldn't have to worry about Damien in the slightest. And this assumption was partially correct. Although Damien's combat prowess allowed him to fight high-level third-class beings, this was only in 1v1 fights. In a group scenario, he'd be extremely limited. Still, escaping would be easy, so he had nothing to fear. Arriving at the penthouse, Yin Jian led Damien to the conference room where the 3 old men had met previously, before calling his companions. "Just wait a few moments for them to arrive, then we can begin any discussion." Yin Jian watched as Damien sat with a leisurely look on his face. He was aware that Damien would be able to sense the other 2 existences within the penthouse, but seeing the relaxed expression on his face, Yin Jian began having some doubts. It can't be that he thinks he can take all three of us at once, right? It didn't take long for Xiao Zhen and Qin Hu to arrive. Looking at the boy in front of them, both of them hid their surprise. Indeed, his talent might even be on par with those geniuses from the central continent, Xiao Zhen thought. Still, he kept indifferent on the outside. What have you come to discuss with us? Damien looked at this man with only a single thought. Strong. Xiao Zhen was strong enough for Damien to be on alert, but he still responded in kind. My purpose today is simple. I'm here to determine whether you lot are allies or enemies. As you already know, I'm a native of this world, so I can't allow you to destroy it or impact it negatively. The three men became serious. I assume that you're already aware that we came here for selfish intentions, Yin Jian said, but we have no intention to do anything permanently harmful to this small world. Damien nodded. He had guessed this much from the beginning. There's no way people from a much stronger world would descend here if they didn't have some sort of machinations or plans. Then, what exactly do you have planned? This time it was Xiao Zhen who spoke. We can discuss these more intricate things later. Just know that rather than us, you should beware of whatever those fiends in Niflheim have planned. Chapter 93, Schemes 4. Niflheim He. Damien felt it was pretty cliché for the evil organization to be the one plotting nefariously, but he still listened to what the old men had to say. We haven't figured out what exactly Niflheim is planning, but we know that in the end, they will destroy the planet. They aren't only this planet's enemy, but also that of our cloud plane. They've been attempting invasion for many years. Xiao Zhen continued. As for our own goal, it is to siphon a part of the natural mana already in this world's atmosphere. Although there are no negative effects in the long term, the denizens here will progress slower for at least a decade before the mana levels return to normal. Hearing this objective, Damien fell into thought. Truthfully, he didn't care about Earth at all after he had saved his mother. He already had plans to move her to Aparen, where the mana density was thicker and society was at peace, so she could live a better life. After all, even in the 4 years he had been gone, Earth had become a small battleground for the stronger worlds within the cosmos. The old man had mentioned the cloud plane, and Damien already knew of its existence. It was one of the many worlds that were discovered through the gates that opened on Earth, and the way the forces of both Niflheim and the cloud plane received Earth's location was most likely through citizens of Earth who were swayed by wealth or power. It had already been mentioned that entry through gates back to the beginner world wasn't permitted to outsiders, so any other possibility could be immediately ruled out. And so, why do you guys need the mana of Earth? Yin Jian and Qin Hu looked toward Xiao Zhen. He was their representative and the one with the most power of the three, so decisions like revealing more about their world to Damien rested on his shoulders. Xiao Zhen took a moment to consider the pros and cons of such an information exchange. On one side, he could gain a valuable ally in this talented youth and also continue unobstructed in their plans with Earth, while on the other, there was the risk of this youth going over to the enemy's side and spilling their secrets. He never once considered the consequences of having Damien himself as an enemy. Even if Damien was powerful by their standards, against their entire world he was nothing. Hell, even against those major powers on the central continent, he was but another young genius who had the potential to rise in power. Thinking this far, Xiao Zhen decided to answer Damien's question. The peak powers of our world have discovered new methods of gaining levels called cultivation. Cultivation is a simple process, as it involves absorbing and circulating ambient mana in specific patterns to increase mana capacity and even level. It was a shocking discovery, but it made sense in the end. Experience points that contribute to leveling up are gained when one enhances or adds to their legend. This concept is one that the system constantly reminds us about when we make large achievements, but it's never fully explained. We still don't know exactly what a legend is, but even years of hard work spent cultivating will earn you experience to level up. While the process may be tens, or even thousands at the higher levels, of time slower than more conventional methods of leveling, it is still extremely beneficial. The only problem is that, with the advent of cultivation, the mana levels of the world weren't able to keep up. This wouldn't have been a problem if it was discovered in the present time, but it's been a common practice in our world for tens of thousands of years. And in the recent times, we've encountered a major threat to civilization. Getting this far, Xiao Zhen's face became solemn. We haven't discovered exactly what they are, but there is a force behind Niflheim that is plotting their movements. We've discovered that this force is much greater than we can fathom. In preparation for war that might come when this force makes a move, the peak powers of our cloud plane have decided on the strategy of stealing mana from lower worlds to supplement our own. This way people will be able to gain strength faster, without having to worry about depleting the mana density of the world. Damien listened to all this with rapt attention. These weren't conflicts on the country scale or even the continental scale, these were wars between worlds. Just thinking about such a grand battle made his blood boil. And he knew what the most likely backer for the forces of Niflheim was. It had to be the Nox. Ever since their invasion of Aparen, they'd apparently kept quiet, but it was obvious they were gathering forces to strike once more. And from what he was hearing, they weren't planning to strike Aparen, but countless other worlds instead. Just what is their purpose? Is it just for domination, or is there something bigger? Damien couldn't help but feel that there was some kind of grand scheme behind the scenes, but he shook off that thought. He didn't have the strength nor the ability to unravel such things. Rather, his thoughts were on something else. The cloud plane seems to be much stronger than Aparen, and if they're going to war with Niflheim, it'd definitely be something he wanted to get involved in. Maybe he couldn't stop the war or act as a one-man army, but he could definitely deal some heavy blows if he planned his moves right. Still, that came later. First, he had to deal with the troubles taking place on Earth. While he didn't care much about it, he knew his mother held attachments to this world. Even if it was just for her sake, he couldn't allow it to get destroyed. But putting it through a decade's worth of setbacks was nothing major. They would still be able to build themselves back up, and Damien assumed that, with such a low quantity of mana, other larger worlds wouldn't hold much interest in Earth. Very well. I don't mind if you guys continue with your plan concerning the mana gathering, but I expect full cooperation when it comes to Niflheim. We can discuss other matters after that is taken care of. The three old men nodded. Although Damien was still just a boy, there was something about his aura and demeanor that made them feel subservient. Even Xiao Zhen felt this. It wasn't a matter of strength nor wits, as together they surpassed Damien in both of these fields. Simply, they felt the natural aura of a leader, not the kind that would sit in the shadows or lead an empire, but of a spiritual pillar who could effortlessly unite people under his banner. The future of this boy will surely be bright. Yin Jian thought to himself. He might have just been a spectator for most of this conversation, but he still had his own opinions on the proceedings. Damien and the three old men talked for a few more hours about various matters before he finally took his leave. He once again decided to walk home, as he had many things to think about. Those old men said that the so-called villains are being transformed and granted power beyond their own level, and those that receive this power mutate into alien-like beings. It sounds awfully similar to the story of the Nox on the temple walls. Back then, the Nox had converted people into puppets for their own use, and when the invasion happened, those followers went around murdering innocent civilians like madmen. The soul fragment of Kurt Galloway had mentioned that these people had abnormal strength, yet they didn't mutate into strange creatures. Well, the methods of a lackey obviously won't be as refined as those of its master. Damien's first priority was to move his mother and Alina off of Earth. If there was even the slightest chance that Earth would become a dangerous place, he wouldn't allow them to stay here. There's also the matter of the cloud plane. Truthfully, Damien wanted to go to the cloud plane alone. He even wanted to leave Rose behind. It wasn't that their strength couldn't contribute to his goals, or that he didn't want their company, rather. He felt that it would be more convenient if there were fewer outsiders suddenly appearing out of nowhere. His initial thought process wasn't like this, though. He had wanted to bring Rose along for this adventure, as he had plenty of fun when they explored the secret realm together, but he had a hard time convincing those old fogies about it. It took an hour to even convince them to allow him to accompany them, so when he asked to bring others, he was vehemently rejected. "Well, I can deal with that problem when the time comes. For now, let's deal with the matters on Earth." He kept getting sidetracked thinking about the future, but he couldn't help himself. Although dealing with schemes on Earth was necessary, it didn't spark his spirit of adventure like traveling to other worlds and participating in planetary battles did. Earth was simply a chore, while those other matters were going to be done out of his own volition. Well, let's deal with Niflheim now. Chapter 94, Preparation 1. Well, even if he wanted to deal with Niflheim immediately, he didn't have the means to do so. After all, he didn't even know where they were located. Xiao Zhen had told him that they would be in the vicinity of LA, but that wasn't much to go on. He wondered if it was even possible to rule out the ocean, but he quickly scraped that thought. If the rest of Earth was simply a playground for Damien, the only place he had to be wary of was the ocean. Even before the World Awakening, more than 80% of the ocean was unmapped and unexplored. The world's terrain had changed since then, and nobody knew what had happened to the ocean. The only known fact was that it was dangerous. The cultivation of beasts was much simpler than that of humans in the sense that they didn't need to level up until they reached 4th class. As long as they ate other beasts, they'd gain power. And so, when the massive oceans of the world came into contact with mana, and the animals within it became beasts, one could only imagine the chaos that would ensue. In the past 3 or so years, sea travel became an entirely unviable option. Boats would immediately get attacked by rampaging beasts even near the shore, and the journey would only become more dangerous when they arrived further at sea. And it wasn't just the native beasts born on Earth that would be a problem. Dungeons weren't around for the benefit of humans. Rather, they were there to support some sort of balance within the universe. At least this is what the denizens of Earth figured out from otherworlders they met in dungeons. And if gates didn't discriminate, then it was obvious that some would open within the ocean. These gates would go untouched and uncleared, and eventually they would lead to dungeon breaks. Beasts within those gates would flood the sea. 2 possible situations would occur from that point forward. The first scenario was when the gate was aquatic in nature, and new species of beasts with varied strength would enter the ocean's ecosystem, either propagating or ruling within the area. The second was when the gate wasn't aquatic in nature. In this scenario, the beasts that break through the gate would, in most situations, end up drowning or being crushed by the pressure of the deep seas. While this may seem to be a better outcome, it wasn't. The corpses of these beasts would be feasted on by those already living in that ecosystem, providing greater strength to the already existing beasts. In the deepest areas of Earth where humans could never reach, there were potentially an innumerable amount of third-class beasts lying in wait. Damien wanted to visit the depths of the ocean one day and see if he could find anything interesting, but now wasn't the time. Maybe once he was finished with the Niflheim business, or after he finished his adventure in the Cloud Plain, he'd return for this purpose. Taking his thoughts off the ocean, Damien decided to check the land areas surrounding the city, and he had to say that he was truly shocked by what he saw. Before his fall, he'd never left Lo's Angels, and after the World Awakening, he didn't even have the mind to watch the news. Even Alina was the same. Due to this, their view on Earth had remained relatively untarnished. But even when Damien simply flew around the other areas of California, he could see the vast differences in both geography and population. Major cities like San Diego or San Francisco were relatively untouched, as their large population meant they'd always have heroes there to protect them from any major damages, but most smaller cities were in ruin. Damien had just been thinking about the evolution of normal animals into beasts that occurred within the ocean, but he'd made an oversight when considering the surface. Even if humans were the most dominant species, that didn't mean there was a lack of animals by any means. Within the countless forests and even the smaller ecosystems that existed, there were many beasts, and with the way the instincts of a beast worked, Damien shuddered at the thought. How much of humanity had truly been decimated already? Even if the strongest and most populated areas maintained a sense of normalcy, what about the rest? How much land had been lost to beasts? Thinking about areas like the Amazon rainforest that were dangerous to humans even before beasts existed on Earth, Damien felt that the situation was much more concerning than he originally thought. Still, it wasn't like he could do anything about it. Even if he tried his hardest, it would probably take years to clean up even just the Amazon. He couldn't imagine shouldering the weight of the world and being a hero who saves everyone. Damien chuckled at the irony of his situation. In general, his worldview was already on a planetary scale. He was thinking about traveling different worlds and participating in massive battles. Yet his view of Earth was still so narrow-minded. Perhaps it was the effect of living in Aparen for so many years, where peace reigned and order had been established. All the while, Damien was still flying around California searching for the Niflheim headquarters. It was one of the largest states in America, so he was essentially searching for a needle in a haystack. Plus, even if he could cover all of California in his search, it would by no means be instant. He had already spent an entire day flying at his fastest speeds, and he'd probably only covered 20% of the state. His power level was still at most enough to destroy a city. But Damien was long past the point of getting fatigued with only this much. Sleep was a luxury for him, not a necessity. Damien continued to search throughout the night and even into the next day without rest. He only stopped when his mana capacity was getting low so he could recharge. And his ceaseless effort finally paid off. Damien was getting bored, so he circled around Sacramento one more time before heading back to Los Angeles. However, he soon stumbled upon a swamp region that seemed to span until the San Francisco area. Wanting to explore the strange terrain a bit, Damien slowed down his travels. It was then that he finally noticed the inconspicuous dome-like structure that existed within the swamp. It was extremely easy to miss, as even its color blended with the murky water, but Damien's perception was too high for such camouflage to work. Ironically, he would have found the area easier if they had used some sort of illusion for concealment. Damien completely hid his aura before carefully approaching the dome. Something about the structure just screamed evil villain base to him. Maybe it was all those comics he read as a kid. Damien didn't rashly enter the dome, since if he was correct about its origins, there were bound to be third classes inside. He simply waited in the air, using his vector control to refract light and become invisible. Along with the earring artifact that hid his presence, his concealment was almost perfect. This wasn't a method he used often, since he had Rose, an illusion expert, by his side, but it was still convenient at times like this. Damien waited patiently for hours, watching for any movement on the outskirts of the dome. And finally, he found what he was looking for. A grotesque man with a globular body and antenna on his head emerged from the dome, flying to some unknown location. So this is what they meant by alien. Well, he definitely looked like something out of a crappy sci-fi movie. Damien continued to watch for the next day as many different people who used to be humans exited and entered the dome. It was enough proof for him that this location was indeed a base of Niflheim. Whether it was the main base or not was yet to be seen, but the old men from Asgard had mentioned that the leaders of Niflheim had situated their main base in California for convenience. All that was left was for Damien to go inform his companions about what he found. He wanted to infiltrate the base and learn of the plans they had for Earth before taking any offensive action or even informing the guys from the Cloud Plane. Their relationship, at best, could be called a partnership. There was no underlying trust that built a foundation for them, only respect for each other's strengths. Damien had to confirm whether the words of those old men were true before he made any drastic decisions. Using his naivety against him wasn't something Damien would allow, and if it happened, it wasn't something he'd take lightly. Though the old men didn't know it, Damien was still in the process of separating allies from enemies. Chapter 95, Preparation 2. After memorizing his location so he could warp back later, Damien flew away from the dome before teleporting back to the house. Arriving, he started telling the girls about what he found. He'd already briefed them about the situation before he left on his search, so he only needed to tell them about the hideout. And since they were already on the subject, he told them about the conditions of the world outside the city. To be honest, it's stupid that we never considered the possibility before you said it, Alina said. She was slightly downcast about the state of the world, but she was similar to Damien in the sense that she knew she couldn't do anything about it, so she didn't fret. However, unlike Damien, she held on to the possibility that once she became strong enough, she could come back and make the world a more peaceful place. After a slight interlude, Damien spoke about the dome-like structure he had found. He also described the mutated people he had seen exiting it. It's pretty obvious what the identity of that structure is, but I have no interest in charging in blindly. Rose, I want you to come with me so we can do a little infiltration mission. Rose nodded. That's no problem. It's been getting a little boring sitting around and doing nothing anyway. What about us? Alina spoke, referring to herself and Zara. Rose has already shown that she can cast illusions on others that don't wear off as long as we have mana, so it shouldn't be a problem for us to join as well. Well, she was talking more for herself than anything. Zara had her own concealment abilities, and they were one of her main strengths. She didn't need any help to hide from others' senses. Damien fell into thought. It was true that Rose could use her illusions to hide Alina if she wanted. Damien's only problem was with safety. If more people infiltrated with him, they'd have to split up, and Damien wouldn't be there to protect them. Rose, seemingly sensing Damien's worries, chimed in. Aren't you being a bit too paranoid? Or did you forget that we aren't some weaklings that are here to burden you? Looking around the room, Damien started to feel like an idiot. It wasn't just Rose, but Alina and Zara as well who were all glaring at him. It was definitely true that he had forgotten their strength. With Rose, although he knew she was strong, he had never seen her fight alone. But that reasoning was illogical. If she couldn't hold her own, how did she even reach him on Godspark Mountain? And wasn't she the one who did the most to kill the Nox within the ancient temple? Zara was the same. Damien had only fought together with her and had never seen her hunt alone, but that didn't mean she never did. When he was building his mana circuits, and when he was within the legacy tomb, even during certain periods while climbing Godspark Mountain, Zara had evolved without Damien's watch. And the final one was Alina. His trust was a bit rockier when it came to her since he had never seen her fight since he came back to Earth. On top of this, she was still at second class unlike the rest of them. Perhaps it was due to the conditions of Earth, but it didn't change the facts. Hesitating a bit, Damien spoke once again while looking at Alina. Fine. Rose and Zara are good, but I've never seen you fight. Spar against Rose, and based on the outcome we can vote on whether you can come or not. Damien felt like he was being too commanding, but it was necessary. Whether he saw this as a serious venture or not didn't matter. To a second class, walking into the den of third classes was almost always suicide. However, it would be a different story if Alina could prove that her prowess matched Damien, and Rose's back when they were near the peak of second class. Alina nodded almost immediately. Not only would she be able to prove she wasn't a burden, but she'd also get to fight Rose, which was something she'd been wishing for since many weeks ago. Receiving her affirmation, Damien teleported the group to a more secluded area on the outskirts of the city. He didn't want to deal with his mother's wrath if they ended up destroying the backyard. Damien sat atop Zara in the distance while Rose and Alina faced each other within the grassy hills they were situated on. Looking at the two, Damien nodded his head. Start. Alina rushed first. She pulled her sword out of the spatial ring Damien had gifted her and appeared directly in front of Rose, moving so fast she left afterimages in her wake. Although surprised, Rose was still able to react calmly. However, she didn't use any weapons since the strength gap was already big enough. She simply shaped the wind around her into a sickle shape and used it to block the oncoming sword. Swoosh! The impact didn't create an explosion, but the shockwave that erupted managed to raise the grass within their vicinity. Rose smirked at this sight. Is that all you can do? Alina usually wouldn't fall for such light provocation, but against Rose, she always felt she couldn't control herself. She immediately resumed her offensive, continuously swinging her sword. She didn't stay in one place, though. Alina's speed was insane as she almost teleported from one spot to another, circling Rose while slashing with her sword. The sword itself was similar to a katana, but its quality wasn't the same as the weapons Damien and Rose had. Only while watching the fight did Damien realize the discrepancy. Looks like we need to get her a replacement soon. Still, the weapon was enough for now. Alina continued to move around Rose as many afterimages started forming. Their movements became synced, and it became almost impossible to tell which was the real Alina. Rose was definitely surprised by this move. She tried to use her wind to disrupt the images, but they didn't budge. It was almost as if they were being supported by something else. It was then that a change occurred. The earth began rumbling as many holes were formed in its surface. Out of these holes, tens of thick tree roots shot towards Rose. Boom! Finally, an explosion was produced. Rose shot wind bullets at the roots, causing massive gashes in their surfaces before cutting them with her wind sword. All this while, Alina kept attacking in the forefront. The battle raged on for another half an hour but didn't seem like it would stop anytime soon. With Alina's strategy of continuous heavy assault, any normal second class would have long since run out of stamina already. But this didn't apply to her. Alina's specialty was always her sustainability in battle. No matter what, she always refused to be the first one to tire out. At this point, Rose had decided it was enough. Alina had already proven herself capable, so she felt the battle didn't need to go on any longer. Wanting to teach Alina a little lesson, Rose made her move. Illusory throne. Along with her words, the environment was caped in darkness. Alina stopped her movement as her afterimages slowly disappeared. Instead of panicking, she warily looked at the surroundings, assessing her options. Figures started emerging from the darkness. Beasts, humans, and grotesque combinations between them charged at Alina. Besides this, many horrible scenes flashed by her vision. Mass slaughters and genocide were displayed before her eyes. Unwilling to succumb to this mental warfare, Alina closed her eyes and covered her body in greenish-white mana. It looked similar to wind element, but everything about it other than its appearance was different. Alina felt a vigorous life aura seep into her body and mind, clearing anything she considered as impurity. When she reopened her eyes, she was back within the darkness. It wasn't that the illusions disappeared or stopped attacking her, rather Alina simply stopped seeing them. It was similar to the effects of Damien's eyes. Staring at the endless abyss that constituted the sky, Alina raised her arm. Judgment. Blinding light emerged from the darkness, bathing everything in its warm glow. However contrary to the purity of its aura, the action itself was deadly. 10 massive golden swords formed in the air. Even Damien could see their light from outside the illusory throne domain. And then Alina dropped her arm. The swords of light shot forward at blinding speeds, hitting their various targets. 3 swords impaled the ground, 3 impaled the ceiling, and the other 4 impacted the walls. Even though everything was constructed from illusions, the swords struck as if they were material objects. And then, another blinding flash occurred as the swords imploded. A rain of light arrows showered the environment around Alina, seemingly unwilling to leave a single spot untouched. And slowly, cracks began forming in the illusory domain. Rose wasn't going to allow this. She summoned her throne and prepared to counter Alina, inadvertently giving up her position. Alina turned to her with the same attitude, ready to fight until one of them dropped. However, their battle was abruptly put to an end. Damien arrived in the middle of the domain and teleported them away from each other, using his vector control to prevent them from moving. All right, Alina has already proven herself. You guys can continue this after we finish our missions. Chapter 96, Infiltration 1. The girls were visibly disappointed that their fight had been interrupted, but they didn't complain. They had other priorities for now. Still, this didn't prevent them from glaring daggers at each other. Damien decided to change the topic to diffuse the tension a bit. Wow, I didn't expect that you'd have grown so strong already. What was that last move you did? And the one with the roots too? Alina beamed as she proudly explained. About a year after you left, I gained a new life affinity. I didn't quite understand it, but its purpose is geared more towards healing. Still, it also encompasses nature, so I can do cool stuff like that. As for that last move, it's a skill I created. Judgment is a light element skill, and you could see its effects from the battle earlier. In the beginning, I could only form a single sword and have it strike an enemy, but now I can do more creative things like the arrow shower I used. Damien was truly impressed. Not only was her combat prowess enough to join them on their mission, but it might also be better than Damien and Rose's own combat prowess when they were at her level. They were both able to Jumo levels within 3rd class and fight stronger opponents. So, for Alina to put up such a good fight against Rose was a true testament to her capabilities. Not to mention that her light element seems to be a direct counter for Rose's illusions. Though Damien wouldn't mention this out loud, he didn't know what kind of backlash he'd suffer if he did. Zara soon joined the girls as they chatted for a few hours while recuperating their mana. Since things were already decided, there was no more need to hesitate. It was almost time to infiltrate Niflheim. Damien took the time when the girls rested to think up a plan. After all, at this point he was still planning on charging in head-on, even if he was doing it in a more concealed manner. He could easily ask Rose for heal, since she had been the main planner in the Monolith Code event during the tournament, but Damien wanted to practice his skills in scheming a bit. It was something he'd need to master in the future, so it was good to get an early start. Even if I want to practice, I have no guidelines to go off of. All I can think of is the fact that we need to infiltrate. Still, this wasn't an area Damien could excel at effortlessly as he did with more physical training. Even when it came to comprehension, his abilities were top tier, but for some reason, it seemed his brain wasn't geared towards long-term planning or scheming. I need at least a basic ability to scheme. If not to scheme myself, it will still be helpful to unravel the schemes of others. Damien continued to think about the plan after infiltrating. He started basic, assigning the team composition. That part was easy. He was able to act as a one-man army on the smaller scale of things, especially on Earth. Thus, he only needed help with concealment. But I still haven't mastered my vector control. Using the light refraction technique would be a good way to practice sustainability. Even if he got caught, it would be light work for him to escape. He was sure there wouldn't be any formations or anything that could lock space, especially since there wasn't even an illusion formation to hide the location. Then, I'll put Rose and Alina together since Alina doesn't have her own concealment methods. At least I think so. There was no way for him to know all of Alina's cards unless she told him, and he respected her privacy, so he never asked. However, Alina had light elements, so she hypothetically should be able to use the same light refraction technique as him, even if it was implemented differently. Maybe she just hasn't thought of it. Either way, he decided to put the two girls on the same team. As for him and Zara, they would work mostly alone. They would still stay near each other, though, so it could only technically be counted as moving solo. As for location, that wasn't something he could plan yet. He did not know the layout or structure of the base, which would be a problem. But none of them possessed memory reading techniques, so it would be hard to get a foolproof answer. I haven't tested the waters when it comes to torture yet. This would be the easiest method for him to gain information. Plus, Since the victims had virtually sold their souls for power, he didn't need to feel remorse for his actions. Good, let's do that. After I figure out the floor plan, I'll put together a rough outline for the rest of the plan. With that thought, Damien vanished from where he stood. The girls were startled at first, but Zara assured them that he was just doing some more preparation before they left. Knowing that he would be gone for a while, Rose and Alina once again fiercely glared at each other. "You're not bad for someone at your level," Rose said in a slightly condescending tone. "Yeah, and you're pretty weak for someone at yours." Alina was quick with a comeback. "If it wasn't for the fact that light was a natural counter, you wouldn't have done so well. If you were really as good as you claim to be, wouldn't a natural counter be too little to stop you? You're just lucky I went easy on you." The girls argued for hours on end. Zara got a kick out of watching this since their fight had devolved into petty insults. Neither of them was willing to back down, but since they didn't see each other as enemies and just as rivals, they were limited on the insults they could actually use. When night finally fell, Damien reappeared in his previous position. The girls had already sensed the spatial fluctuations and stopped their argument. "All right then, here's the plan." Naturally, both Rose and Alina were dissatisfied that they had been paired up, but in the end, they said nothing. It was for the success of the plan, or at least that's what they told themselves. After splitting up the teams, Damien went on to the further details. "There's nothing much that needs to be said. The hideout is like a bunker that spans deep into the earth, but I don't know much else. However, the entire third floor of the bunker is sealed off to all personnel, since it's where their leaders reside." This was all the information Damien could get. Even after using any torture method, he was creative enough to come up with. The usage of the facilities from the fourth floor down were also outlined, but everything after the 65th floor was unknown even to the strongest of the villains he'd captured. When Damien told this to the girls, they were able to connect the dots. That must be where the juicy stuff is. Right, if we want to find anything besides run-of-the-mill villain stuff, we'll have to get into those floors. Damien also agreed with this. He had already told them that the enemies were otherworlders rather than the villains of Earth, so their opinions were formed with all information they currently had. "Also, I learned that the security isn't that tight until you reach those deeper floors. They don't seem to have many branch locations, so there's a constant influx of villains going in and out. The personalities of these villains are also varied, with some of them being super eccentric. A lot of them are stuck in crazed delusions because they have power. As long as we aren't obvious, it shouldn't be a problem fitting in. All we need to do is figure out how to infiltrate the 65th floor," Damien added. "Well, we can each use our own methods to get past that hurdle. If we plan too thoroughly, we won't be able to react with fluidity if things go south," Rose explained. The other two also nodded, and from then on, there was no need for further talk. Damien warped them to the concealed location he had marked previously, and Rose promptly put the three of them in disguise. Zara returned to her old spot within Damien's shadow, which had gone unused for the past many months. At least until they had made proper entry into the building, this type of move was necessary. Quickly, the three of them split into the predetermined teams. "Be safe, and if you get caught, your first priorities are your lives," Damien said as he looked at the two girls. They nodded back in affirmation before parting ways. Around half an hour after the girls left, Damien also made his way towards the entrance of the large dome. "Now, Niflheim, let's see if you can show me something interesting." Chapter 97, Infiltration 2. Beginning the infiltration was simple. All Damien had to do was walk into the dome-like structure as if he belonged there in the first place. Nobody questioned him and nobody stopped him. There wasn't even any sort of identification point inside. Damien walked in a pompous manner as if he viewed himself as someone above everyone surrounding him, and this air alone made people avoid him. Nobody liked conversing with pretentious people. The area of the dome-like structure was mostly empty, with some training rooms that seemed to be there solely as cover for everything happening underneath. Scattered around the area were plenty of elevators, one of which Damien took. The numbers on the elevator were a quick indicator of how status worked. From 4 through 64, anyone could travel, but to go below floor 65, there was some sort of keycard identification necessary. Damien clicked the number 50 and quickly descended through the bunker. The entire frame of the elevator was made from glass, and only after the first 3 floors did Damien realize why. The darkness that enshrouded him quickly opened up as the scenery was revealed to him. It was quite a marvelous sight, reminding Damien of a movie he'd watched once. The bunker was similar to a coliseum in that the central area was hollow and the floors were rings around it. When Damien tried to look to the bottom of the hollow area, all he saw was an abyss. Even if the entire middle section of the floors were cut, each floor wasn't small in the slightest. Damien could see the countless different people working within the floors, with plenty of them even resembling normal office workers. Not everyone in Niflheim is a villain. Some of them just needed a way to make a living. Being someone who'd gone through many years holding a similar mindset, Damien understood them entirely. He didn't blame these people for their decisions, nor did he have a desire to make them collateral damage. But if things escalated to that point, people live and people die. Whether I sympathize or not doesn't change the fact that they work for a so-called villain organization. They must have been prepared to face the consequences. At least this was how Damien tried to convince himself. He was simply trying to justify the actions he might take. He tended to be an overthinker, planning for situations that might never happen in the future, but knowing that didn't stop him from thinking about it. Damien soon reached the 50th floor. The reason he didn't descend directly to the floors in the 60s was not only to avoid suspicion, but also to get a feel for the atmosphere in the bunker. As the elevator doors opened, Damien stepped out into the bustling space. Code 15 at booth A. Code 27 at booth G. Damien was immediately greeted with code words and phrases being thrown about. This floor was for both support and monitoring of outside activity. While villains tended to do what they want, there were plenty that used other methods to gain money, status, or even power. Trading was one of these ways and contribution points were another. It was a system set up within Niflheim that most villains followed, and although there were plenty of material rewards to be gained through this system, there was one in particular that most people aimed for. Mutation Center. The words were written on a holographic screen, followed by various numbers for the different options one could choose from. The most expensive of these were full-body mutations, but there were less costly options to mutate only a single limb or even just the head. They must not have the capital to wantonly mutate everyone who wants it, so they set up this system to funnel out the useless ones. It was honestly a good system, and one that was used by plenty of people regardless of the worlds they came from. Damien watched on as the queue for this particular station continued to move. He was curious about how the mutation center worked, since the victims of such mutation never seemed in pain nor were they unhappy, but he didn't have time to do so immediately. First, Damien focused on his objective. After wandering aimlessly for a while with the same pompous attitude, Damien entered the bathroom on the floor and cast his light refraction. He had already tested whether his spatial abilities would work when he was wandering the floor, so he knew light refraction would be easy. Damien had also taken the time to check the security set up on the floor. There were indeed cameras set up in various places to monitor whether any mishaps were occurring, and Damien knew where they were. Their positioning didn't leave many blind spots, so the rest of Damien's plan would require a good amount of patience. He couldn't even open the bathroom door on his own to exit, as it would be weird to see the door randomly opening and closing on its own. He had to wait for someone else to open it before he slipped through the cracks. Since light refraction was anchored to his body rather than being a field-type power, he didn't need to worry about alerting people by accident. And Damien's opportunity came easily. Once he left the bathroom, he repeated the same process to enter the elevator and once again played the waiting game. This time, it was much harder for him to achieve anything. At first, he had thought of using the mutation center as his method to descend, but since it was an unknown, he chose the longer yet safer method. He waited in the elevator until someone with a keycard entered as well. This wait took a few hours, and Damien had stopped consistently using his own mana to conceal himself. Since his physical presence was hidden by his earring artifact, and he could hide his aura through his years of practice in the dungeon, all he needed to do was actually hide his body. And Zara was a perfect help for this. For the first time since they'd met, Damien got to feel what it was like to join Zara in the shadows. She melded him into the long shadows in the elevator, and the two of them simply sat together and waited. Hours went by, but their patience was rewarded. A woman with a badge entered the elevator. Except, instead of going to the 65th floor, she went directly down to floor 90. Considering the fact that there were only 100 floors the elevator could access, she must have been someone with high status. I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that I'm starting on the 90th floor, so let's just hope for the best. Meanwhile, Rose and Alina didn't have to play such an absurd waiting game to gain access to the lowest floors. When they entered the bunker, they did it in a similar way as Damien, giving off unapproachable airs as they entered the elevator. They went directly down to the 64th floor from there, not wanting to delay in the slightest. Exiting the elevator, the two girls calmly walked up to the security gate blocking entry before a card appeared in Rose's hand. Swiping the card gained her instant access to the floor. The card was completely made of illusions, yet it seemed to exist on the physical plane. Through the knowledge she gained from the Legacy Tomb rewards, Rose was able to create solid constructs like this card. Even though the size was still limited to such a small scale, the insinuations of such an ability preached of limitless potential in the future. As for the design of the card, Alina had taken care of that. She had used her life magic to lock onto the life aura of a man they had entered the elevator with, manipulating his body into pulling out his own identity card. They had gotten lucky enough to meet a researcher on entry. As for how Alina was able to do such a thing with life magic, even Rose was curious, but it wasn't the time to ask. She could seek answers once everything was over. Rose used the information Alina had pulled to replicate the card, allowing them easy access to the lower floors. Considering how constantly the two girls fought, it was surprising how well they worked as a team when they got serious. Passing the bolted doors that had once prohibited their entry, the first thing that greeted the girls was rows of researchers in lab coats. Each of them was hunched over their own workstations, focusing on nothing but the projects in front of them. Even while glancing at what they were doing, Rose and Alina kept their indifferent facades. But on the inside, they were genuinely disgusted. After all, it wasn't hard to figure out what the material these researchers were using was. Even if it was in small amounts, the aura of a human couldn't be mistaken. Even if it came from deformed lumps or pieces of skin on metal trays. Chapter 98, Infiltration 3. What were the qualities that described a human? Some would argue that it was their nature, while some would take a biological standpoint. Though there were many different ways people classified humanity and humans, none of them would fit the scenes in front of Rose and Alina. Yet it was undeniable that the materials used by the researchers were from humans. Alina's voice suddenly rang through Rose's head. "Don't panic. This is a technique I learned using mana. Anyway, whatever those things that are giving off human aura truly are, some of them are giving off even more prevalent life aura." Rose's body slightly shook at this revelation. Whether they were human or not became less important with this information. After all, wasn't Alina telling her that some of these things were alive? Rose wanted to figure out how the lumps of flesh she was seeing could be alive, but it wasn't the right choice. She knew that they would find more answers if they continued traveling. While they walked through the halls, Rose taught herself to use the same technique Alina just did. It wasn't that hard, since it purely relied on mana. She simply created a thread of mana and shot it into Alina's head, using it to project her thoughts. She didn't know how this kind of method was undiscovered on Aparen. Then again, it might be known, but she just wasn't taught to use it. In the end, all that mattered was that she had learned it now. I think we should descend to the next floor rather than continue on this one. Judging by what's happening over there, that's where the supply of these things comes from. Rose transmitted as she signaled towards a certain area of the hall. When Alina looked over, she saw a tube-like object that was constantly producing these balls of flesh. Its source seemed to be further down in the bunker. Nodding toward Rose to show her affirmation, Alina began walking in the direction of the staircase she saw in the distance. Rose soon followed suit. The staircase was barely lit, causing the eeriness the two already felt from the previous scenes to multiply. However, it was nothing compared to what they felt when they reached the next floor. Rather than rows on rows of researchers, what filled this floor were large glass tubes. Rose could only infer their function based on her surroundings, but Alina knew exactly what was going on. The only problem was, she never expected to see such a scene in real life. Each and every tube out of the hundreds that spanned the hall was filled with clear liquid, and within that liquid were living beings, seemingly in deep slumber. Not all of these beings were human, but most of them were. Yet, even the humans could barely be considered as such anymore. The deformities that besieged them ranged from smaller things like extra fingers or strange protrusions that jutted from their bodies, to more gruesome things like two conjoined heads or extra arms that seemed to have been transplanted onto them rather than natural. Only one trait was shared between every being in the tubes. Each and every one of them had thick black lines running through their body like veins. Some of them were more prominent on the outside, resembling tattoos. It was honestly disgusting. Each of these beings was rigged with countless different wires and machines monitoring their vitals and other biological data, and periodically, small razors emerged within the tubes to slice off parts of their bodies. No blood was spilled, and the cut parts were regenerated immediately. Not even a spike was seen in the heart rates of these beings as they were mutilated. Either their minds were already lost, or they had become numb to pain due to all the torture. Neither Rose nor Alina wanted to find out. Even if this was the source of the matter being experimented with on the 65th floor, they didn't care. They wanted to move on, but both of them knew that if they continued, they'd only find more gruesome scenes. Still, they steeled their hearts and descended to the next floor, but it was just the same as the one before it. Hundreds of beings in glass tubes that stood stationary as they were mutilated and rebuilt. The girls ignored these scenes and continued down until they reached the 75th floor. And indeed, what they found was much worse than the previous floors. Rather than the finished products of the experiments, they found researchers in the process of creating them. Subject 1258 is primed for dosage, one of the researchers said. Affirmative, rolling video log to monitor changes. Unlike the ones on the 65th floor, the researchers here were decked in full hazmat suits. Currently, the girls were only focusing on a single group, but there were countless others like them within the floor. This group surrounded a man who was naked and strapped to a metal table. His mouth was covered, but the terror in his eyes was clear as day. Rose and Alina watched as the leader of this particular group took syringes full of murky black liquid and injected them into the subject's body. As the liquid entered his body, the man froze up. His eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible as his whole body jerked in place. And then it was mayhem. The man suddenly began thrashing around violently, ignoring the chains that strapped him down. The mechanisms that secured his head and blocked his mouth were destroyed, and the man's screams resounded through the area. Black veins began forming on the man's chest before spreading through the rest of his body. When they reached his throat, even the man's voice was destroyed. The veins pulsated as they grew in number, soon covering his entire body. And then an even more horrifying scene played out. A giant hole appeared in the man's thigh as blood sprayed out like a fountain, showering the researchers in crimson. However, the blood rain didn't last long. Like thousands of worms crawling in his body, the man's skin wriggled around and began extending. Following this was the formation of new muscles and bones. It wasn't just his thighs. Where the man's heart should have been, another massive hole opened. One could even see the cold metal of the table from underneath this hole. An arm began forming, turning into two before the hole completely closed. The man's eyes had already lost the light of sanity, and it was clear he couldn't think. Like a crazed beast, he ground his teeth and growled at anything that got near him. The black veins on his body became more pronounced, carving themselves into the very being of his existence. At that point, the lead researcher hit a button. A formless gas flooded the area, slowly putting the man into a forced coma. Another failure, put him with the rest to be studied by the ones above. One of the researchers nodded and followed these instructions. The man was put into a similar glass tube to the ones the girls had witnessed previously and handed off to another member. It was clear where he was headed. The girls could only look at each other with shock evident in their eyes. What did we just witness? Alina was more shaken of the two. While Rose had seen the graphic depictions in the temple walls that showed the maniacal behavior of people and had also witnessed torture herself, Alina hadn't been exposed to this kind of thing in the slightest. Actually, it might be one of the first murders she'd witnessed. She didn't count beasts, as she always saw them as a tool to gain experience, but it was different when it was humans. After all, this was her own species. She couldn't overcome the trauma so easily. Still, Alina tried her best to ignore the disgust and fear she was feeling. This wouldn't be the last time she saw harrowing scenes, and she knew she'd have to kill humans at some point. On top of all this, it would jeopardize their current mission if she freaked out. Alina could only promise herself that she'd destroy the organization conducting such terrible experiments with her own hands. It was the only method she had to quell her fear. "I'm getting a bad feeling about this," transmitted Rose. "That black substance, the way it moves is eerily similar to the Nox being me and Damien met previously." She couldn't shake the feeling that there was some sort of massive plot behind these actions, especially seeing how Niflheim was mutating villains and how the Nox mutated their followers from other races. Rose shook her head. "For now, we just observe. We can think of a way to deal with this and also figure out more about what's happening when we meet up with Damien." While the girls were recovering from the brutal scene they'd just witnessed, Damien was feeling something entirely different. Even with the trepidation that he felt from the very core of his being, Damien couldn't help but feel it. Oh! He could only describe the massive structure in front of him as awe-inspiring. Chapter 99, Core 1. When the elevator stopped on the 90th floor, Zara seamlessly attached her shadow to the researchers so they could enter the facility uninhibited. Zara's shadow worked similarly to a subspace in that it could both hold living beings and was concealed from most people's perception. This subspace used shadows as a base, and like such could latch to shadows and be carried by them. In such a dimly lit area like the underground bunker, Zara's ability was extremely useful. And so, Damien and Zara were carried by the researcher as she walked through the facility. Similar to the 60th floor, there were hundreds of different researchers at their workstations handling separate matters. The difference was the subject of experimentation. The 90th floor was much more technologically advanced, with holographic screens prevalent throughout its area that showcased many large numbers that Damien couldn't even hope to understand. Besides these, there were many machines he had never seen before, most likely not originating from Earth. Damien was surprised by the sheer number of people that were working in this area, and assuming that there were similar numbers on the 25 floors above it, it was truly obscene. But at the same time, not all these people had to be from Earth. And even if they were all from Earth, a population of several billion still had the capability to support such a large group. Shaking off any useless thoughts, Damien continued to watch the proceedings around him as the researcher he was following met up with a few others. "Lynn, how is the progress on the extraction mission?" one of them asked the woman. "It's proceeding as expected, however. we are still unable to find the source of the recently established connection. Its nature is too ethereal for us to study using the equipment provided for this lower world. Not to mention, the core itself rejects our presence. It's been long theorized that the core of a world has the capability to gain sentience and form a will, but there's been no proof. Even if we fail our original goal, if we can prove the existence of a world's sentience, it would be a common-sense shattering discovery. Indeed, it's already proven that plant life forms can gain sentience with prolonged absorption of mana. The carnivorous ones can even utilize the records to level up. There have been a few cases on our own world where plant life forms gained humanoid form after gaining enough power. The researchers began discussing in a fervor. Whether it was their original task or not, they didn't care. They moved in the pursuit of science and truth, and any discovery that correlated with this would earn their blind devotion until they had solved its mysteries. But it didn't take long for them to be forced back to reality. Lynn, the researcher who Damien had been following, spoke up. Silence. Regardless of what we want to study, it isn't our choice this time. If we don't complete the mission that the higher-ups have given us, you know the consequences. Don't get too comfortable with the atmosphere here. Niflheim is not a forgiving world, and even your families will suffer if you make a mistake. At the mention of family, a gloomy atmosphere descended on the researchers. It was true that none of them wanted to do what they were being tasked to. None of them were inhumane to the point where the loss of billions of lives wouldn't weigh on their shoulders. Still, for the sake of their love of science, well-being, and most importantly the well-being of those they cared for, they forged on. The group of scientists moved together as they passed the less important researchers that surrounded them and entered a structure that constituted the center of the floor. Unlike the abyss of the normal floors, there was no hole in the center of this one. Instead, it was another facility that was even more heavily guarded than the ones on the 65th floor. Damien watched from the shadows as the scientists went through 5 different bolted doors of varying density and performed tests to prove their identity. At the most basic layer, there was a retina scan and fingerprint scan, but as they progressed, things got more complicated. Aside from a separate keycard needed for entry, they also went through an area that tested their mana signature, blood, and many more facets that made up one's identity. It was truly rigorous, and there was even a test to see if any foreign mana lingered on the scientists' bodies. Damien was slightly stressed during this one, as Zara's shadow was qualified as foreign mana, but they passed without a problem. It seemed the equipment here was meant to deal with a lower world, so none of it exceeded S-rank in quality. Zara's concealment wouldn't be ousted by a mere S-rank artifact. Once they entered the facility, Damien was greeted by pristine white walls and tens of researchers in hazmat suits. Compared to the outside, the amount in here was minuscule. Each of them was in front of a holographic screen as they tested numerous equations, trying to find the correct path to complete their tasks. Lynn ignored all of this and went to the center of the room, where a large circular platform was located. Stepping on this platform with her colleagues, she was promptly teleported to the very bottom of the bunker. Here, there were no signs of civilization, nor were there other researchers. The only ones allowed access to this area were the big bosses of the organization and this group of 5 researchers. It was a massive cavern filled with gnawing darkness. Not even a single lamp or even torch was used to light up the area. Still, the scientists paid this no mind and continued walking in a straight line. As they walked, Damien began to see a bluish glow emerge from the distance. At first, it was simply enough to illuminate the shadows within the cavern, but as they drew closer, the light became blinding. The scientists were already prepared for this and had the appropriate equipment to circumvent the problem, but Damien wasn't. The blinding light corroded any shadow present in the vicinity, forcing him and Zara out of their concealment. Luckily, the scientists were occupied and the two made no noise. Damien was able to cast light refraction before any changes were noticed, and due to his earring artifact, no trace of his presence was left in the area. Still, something reacted to him. The The source of the blinding light slightly thumped as if acknowledging his presence, but it was so slight that it went unnoticed by everyone in the area. The scientists continued to walk towards the bright light, and the entire cavern was filled with a wondrous blue color. When Damien followed them, he felt a sensation like none other. It was mystical and enchanting, yet grounded in reality. A sudden memory flashed into his head. A river filled with starlight of a similar color. Even if its properties were entirely different, the image of the river wouldn't leave his head. Damien was forced to crouch down due to pain and clutch his head. Something within him was forcing that memory to lay dormant, trying to force him into forgetting it. When the memory resurged, whatever that thing was caused immense waves of pain to crash through his head until he stopped attempting to recall it. Damien truly wanted to know what it was that he saw and why it was so dangerous to remember it, but now wasn't the time. He caught back up to the scientists, who had reached the source of the glow. It was a massive empty space that looked similar to a quarry, but there was nothing inside. Well, almost nothing. In the middle of the empty space, floating with no support, was a huge ball of blue light. The ball was at least the size of the moon as a whole, maybe even larger. Especially with its expansive diameter, it genuinely looked like a celestial body. Damien stared at this massive ball of light. He felt like if he really tried, he could reach out and touch it, but another part of him felt that he'd be immediately incinerated if he did so. The strangest part was that the huge object didn't give off any aura or waves of power, even though the entire area around it was filled with that same mystical sensation Damien felt earlier. He was enthralled by the sight. The core of this small world called Earth. It's a marvelous scene no matter how many times I see it. It's confusing how a world recently introduced to mana could have such a magnificent core. Indeed, the universe is filled with countless wonders. It's a shame that we are forced to rob one of them of its majesty. Still, it must be done. Commence Trial 127 for Project Title, Core Extraction. Chapter 100, Core 2. Rose and Alina finally made it past the experiment areas onto the 80th floor. The things they saw on the past 5 floors were so harrowing that the two were forced to take a break and collect themselves. Regardless of any torture Rose had witnessed or any brutality either of the girls had committed, the happenings in those experiments were truly enough to induce their gag reflex. The struggle to fight the urge to vomit was intense. Concealed by illusions, the two sat in an inconspicuous corner of the staircase to the 80th floor and rested. Currently, they were conversing via mental transmission. "So how are you doing? Are you sure you can continue?" Rose asked worriedly. Any teasing or mischievous attitude she held previously was entirely gone. "I'll be fine," Alina responded, though her voice was weak and shaking. Her entire body was shivering occasionally as she recalled what she had witnessed. What kind of terrible people do you have to be to do such a thing? And why would they even do it in the first place? I just don't understand. Rose sighed. Although she had an inkling of what the injections they saw were, it didn't make anything better. This is a scheme we won't be able to see through yet. Think about it, Earth is such a small world. There's no way that this is the only planet where they're doing such inhumane things. Alina shivered even more. She was imagining how throughout the expansive universe countless beings were going through that excruciating pain, with none being the wiser. Just the thought made her entire being deflate. Alina, at the end of the day, was someone who wielded both the life and light elements. Her affinity was holy and pure, striving toward peace. Even if she was a frontliner, these characteristics still reflected on her. It wasn't an odd thing in the slightest for one to be influenced by the affinities they were born with. They were intrinsically linked to the very core of one's being, so it was normal for them to influence one's character. As proof of this, Damien was always acting mysteriously, seeking to explore the vastness of the universe. He wanted everything to be within the palm of his hand. Not because he had some sort of ambition to rule, but rather it was simply a desire he had for no purpose. At most, it could be said to be a product of his overthinking, and his wanting there to be no situation he couldn't react to. Zara was cute and innocent personality-wise, but she always remained with Damien. Her main goal in life was to be his shadow and to travel with him as one. Maybe it was because of the dependence she developed for him, but it was still partly influenced by her element. Not to mention her behavior towards outsiders. If anyone she didn't allow attempted to touch her, they'd most likely lose an arm. She was cold as ice to those she didn't trust. And finally, there was Rose. Rose had grown up in an imperial household and always had the desire to be free. This stemmed from her life spent without leaving the castle, and it was empowered by her wind affinity. Not to mention, she was extremely mischievous. The way she liked to tease Alina simply because she saw her as a love rival, it was clear where the influence came from. Most of the time, the inherent parts of their personalities were amplified by their affinities, and sometimes there were only subtle clues to indicate them. Alina was always the caring type. It was just that this side of her was always reserved for Damien. Just like how she had spent high school trying to brighten his days because she couldn't help with his bullying. And just like how she consistently took care of his mother after he fell, even if almost every part of her called herself crazy for clinging to hope. Even if Damien had truly died, Alina would have stayed taking care of his mother as long as she could, and she'd have held on to her hope that he would return as long as she possibly could. She was truly kind-hearted at the end of the day, and even if she could ignore how ruthless Damien got because of his circumstances, she couldn't ignore the suffering of innocence. It made her sick to her stomach, and it made her question what she was even fighting for. This is why we need strength. Rose's voice sounded in her head. With absolute strength, nobody would dare slight you. With absolute strength, your will can be enforced by the many, and with absolute strength, nothing will stand in your way. Alina looked up into Rose's goldish ruby eyes. So continue to get stronger, until nobody can act in a way you see as wrong again. Get strong to the point where you can enact your justice as you please. Alina's eyes began to tear up. It was unexpected that this advice would come from Rose, but it was exactly what she needed to hear. Embracing Rose tightly, Alina silently cried until she couldn't cry anymore. And when she had successfully vented her emotions and steeled her will to move forward, the duo entered the 80th floor. Commenced Trial 131 for Project Title, Core Extraction. Many different machines had descended into the spacious cavern as the scientists continued their trials. At this point, it had already been close to a day since they started. Damien watched from the shadows as giant drills attempted to pierce Earth's core as he gritted his teeth. To him, this issue became much more serious over the past day. As the scientists became more brutal and forceful in their experiments, Damien began to feel something through the ethereal connection he had to Earth. In the first place, this connection had always been more powerful than the rest, and the fact that he was directly next to the core only made it stronger. Within Damien's head, he could swear he heard screaming. It was a cry of pain from a childlike voice, and because their connection was intimate, he could tell that the voice was Earth's. He had heard when the scientists talked about the theory of worlds gaining sentience, but he hadn't paid much attention to it. He had thought of it as the crazed ramblings of mad scientists, but now he was having a hard time disregarding it. Even if the voice he could hear was mostly incoherent, even if it couldn't form a single true thought, its pain was still transmitted to him. Something was reaching out to him from the other side of his connection. When Damien allowed this attempt through, he immediately felt pain racking his entire body. The location of the pain was eerily similar to the positioning of the drills attempting to pierce the core. It was impossible to deny it anymore. The Earth itself was asking for his help. Damien bit his tongue until he drew blood. He had to wait patiently, or he would lose any opportunity he would possibly have to stop things. He honestly didn't have a single idea of how to even begin. How was he supposed to stop such a massive operation without revealing himself? And even if he did reveal himself, what would he do afterward? There were still at least 3 third-class beings within this bunker, and he felt it was imperative to not alert them to his presence. As Damien pondered, another signal was sent from the other side of his connection. Rather than something like sharing pain, this time he felt that it was a message. Allowing the request to proceed, Damien's mind was flooded by thoughts. None of them were coherent, but the sheer power of the jumbled mess of thoughts was enough to almost cause his brain to cease functioning. Damien was forced to cut the connection to save himself. As expected of the planet itself, even if it doesn't have any viable means to use its power, the sheer scale of the power it holds is immense. Even if it couldn't consciously mobilize mana, it still had enough mana to supply its entire body, which was Earth itself. The consciousness of this being was vast even if it had only recently gained sentience. He wondered if planets could even gain strength, or if they could become humanoid, but that didn't matter. Once he was able to think properly, he was able to figure out the Earth's intentions. It wants me to bind it. Damien understood the concept, as he had seen it happen in many pieces of fictional literature, but he didn't expect it to happen in real life. It wants me to become a star master. Or, no, perhaps this is what it means to be a celestial. The title of celestial was overbearing, even if it only connected him to the stars. Until this point, Damien never found a way to truly advance his understanding of this class. That is, until today. The only method Damien knew was the contract he had used with Zara, but that wouldn't work on a being without blood like the Earth. Or perhaps, Damien poured every bit of mana he had stored within his body into his connection with Earth, feeding it to the core, and in response, the core did the same. When the two different types of magic power connected, swoosh,